Marx's literary style. Ludovico Silva. Karl Marx. Warnings. 1. Although some of the versions of Marx's texts analyzed here have been made especially for this book, most of the time the translations by Wenceslao Rosas are used. On some occasions I have allowed myself to make some slight tweaks to Rosas's versions, in order to highlight certain stylistic features, without implying in any way the claim to correct such a precise and clear translator of Marx. 2. In order to facilitate the task of readers familiar with the language in which Marx wrote, I offer at the end of this essay, before the bibliography, the corresponding German texts of the main passages of Marx used in the book. When the footnotes are accompanied by an asterisk, it means that they refer to those texts, whose numbering corresponds to that of the notes. We make an exception with the fragments of Mesure de la Philosophie, a work written by Marx in French and quoted here in that same language. It is not difficult to guess the reaction that the mere title of this essay will arouse in the reader. Marx's literary style. Was Marx a literate time? Or is it more of a new study of his ideas about literature and art? One thing or another. Let us think again about the expression, the literary style of Marx. Marx was a writer, he left an impressive work. This work constitutes a scientific corpus, a theoretical fabric. But this corpus, in addition to its conceptual bones, has an expressive musculature. This theoretical fabric has been woven through specific literary threads. The scientific system is supported by an expressive system. In Marx, this expressive system includes, or is, a literary style. It is literary because, just as poetry encompasses a realm that goes beyond that of verse and extends in practice to many kinds of language, so literature as such, as a concept and as a practice, goes far beyond works of fiction or imagery and spans the entire broad field of writing. But in addition, Marx's expressive system constitutes a style, a peculiar, non-transferable expressive genius, with its characteristic verbal modules, its analogical and metaphorical constants, its vocabulary, its economy, and its prosodic dance. The concept of style is more restricted than that of literature. In the case of scientific writers, while it is true that all of them practice and have a literary expression, it is no less true that only very few practice and have a style. That is to say, a genius consciously placed at the service of a desire for expression that is not content with the good conscience of having used the scientifically correct terms, but accompanies it with a literary conscience determined that what is correct is, in addition, expressive and harmonious, and willing to achieve through all the resources of language that the logical construction of science is, in addition, architectural of science. Science loses nothing, and it gains a lot in return, if it adds illustrative rigor to its demonstrative rigor. There is nothing that contributes so much to the understanding of a theory as an appropriate metaphor, or an analogy that fits it. In the specific case of Marx, his desire for style took him very far. The part of his work that he was able to polish and print constitutes, as he himself observes, an artistic whole, but it is so not only because of the architectural structure it exhibits, but also because even its most insignificant details appear polished, smooth and illuminated many times by means of such a finished metaphorical art that it could well be said of many of its concepts that they have the appearance of percepts. In one of his youthful verses, Marx says of the poet, was sinnet, erkend, und was one let, ersermer. That is to say, he perceives what he thinks and thinks what feel. This formula is applicable to all of Marx's work, and especially to that made up of works such as Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, or Book I of Capital, 1867, which, as said, they were fortunate that they did not have other works, like the Grundriss. They received the final polish, the incisive and meticulous file of a writer who had the ability to design his phrases artistically and endow his ideas with infinite plasticity, to personal pride. In order to make them more accessible and also in order to defeat in practice that kind of verbal fetishism that turns scientific language into an abstruse, hieratic, and dead jargon, incapable of exerting a direct action on the general public. It is for this reason that today any moderately educated person can read with pleasure that masterpiece of scientific prose that is the contribution to the critique of political economy, learning all the content and, moreover, learning to reason economically. For it is characteristic of all great thinkers who are also great stylists to present their works not as the result of previous thoughts, but as the very process or act of thinking. Thus, the reader attends a relentless birth, and benefits from it, because instead of being forced to digest hardened thoughts, he is encouraged to think, to recreate the very act of theoretical discoveries. One may not previously know anything about economics, but if the critique is read with due attention, one will be forced to reason economically, to rethink the structure of economics from its most primitive and abstract foundations, from its cells, merchandise, value. It seems as if Marx had dedicated himself expressly to demonstrating in practice in his style that ideas are not something intangible or invisible, but something that can be seen and perceived. He, who knew the ancient Greek language thoroughly, knew well that the word idea originally means external aspect, appearance, form. When Plato, in Protagoras, 315e, says 1ri1 vvy 0-70, what he means is simply something like beautiful in appearance, beautiful in shape. The verb ioif did not mean anything other than to see with one's own eyes. And what did the word theory, ekagia, mean, if not the action of seeing, contemplating, observing? That is why what Marx thinks is something that can be perceived plastically, the conceptual has in it perceptual value. This is what happens thanks to a literary style capable of giving the most complicated abstractions the appearance of true ideas. Endowed with graceful form and color, his theories can be visualized, just as his conception of society can be visualized metaphorically as a gigantic architecture endowed with its economic foundation zero structure and its ideological building or facade, Überbau. Metaphors that help us to perceive the properly scientific or theoretical content. On the other hand, we insist here on the need not to take for explanations what are only metaphors, nor conversely, take for metaphors what are explanations. Many make such an investment, and do nothing more than misunderstand and falsify the thought and style of Marx. Against these misunderstandings, see infra, paragraphs 2.3.l and 2.3.2. I have proposed a stylistic rereading of Marx, important not only because it is a practically virgin aspect of Marx's work, but, what is more important, because such a reading is essential to separate what is metaphor from what is which is theoretical explanation, aspects which are so confused in Marxism today that there is almost no Marxist who does not speak seriously of the reflection theory or the superstructure theory, when such theories do not exist at all as theoretical theories, but as metaphors. If Marx's work did not offer along with these metaphors the most detailed scientific explanations, there would be some reason to be confused. With this of Marx's metaphors a monumental confusion has occurred, and so deep-rooted that it is now very difficult to clarify it. If his theories and ideas have become mere beliefs for many today, conversely, his main metaphors have been turned into explanations. No matter how absurd they may be as such, the FC in Marx is today capable of swallowing anything, no matter how indigestible it may be. What happens with this is something similar to what Unamuno recounts in his 1896 essay about the Rkvo, of orlography, regarding the much-quoted evangelical analogy. It is more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of cycles, than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Since classical times, the Greek m11 was read the same as the iota, l, in such a way that iam7 oc, camelos, camel, was read the same as *aiu7.o, camillos, cable or calibrode, which Unamuno says. Due to this confusion, it was concluded. A misspelling that meant that where there should have been a cable nothing less than a camel would appear, which from the point of view of the analogy is nonsense. However, secularly accepted the error, all kinds of ingenious explanations have been produced to justify that camel. The same has happened with Marx's metaphors. Taking his work as gospel, they want to make us go through a camel, and superstructure and reflection try to accommodate and justify themselves as explanations of the ideological phenomenon, without realizing the neo-evangelical commentators that if ideology really if it were a superstructure or a reflection, then Marx would be on the one hand the most ardent Platonist believer in a separate and independent world of ideas mounted on the social structure, and on the other he would be a defender of the absurd thesis that he makes of ideas and social values a passive and helpless reflection, an inactive and purely specular world. When mentioning Unamano I have remembered a stupendous word of his that fits Marx perfectly, idioclast. If iconoclasts are idol breakers, Unamano said, I am an idioclast or idea breaker. And he said so in an article about the idocracy or empire of ideas. Marx was an idioclast all his life, one of the fiercest and most vicious idea breakers there has ever been. This is one of the aspects of his literary and intellectual style that I will study here. Unamano also said that his fight was against the ideologiqueros. Hence, nothing is as similar as the literary styles of Unamano and Marx. In matters of DC, stigmatize ideas or characters in the most implacable way, but preserving the serenity of reasoning, it is difficult to find others who equal them. This is one of the most striking features, though not the most profound, of Marx's style. It was an active part of his will to transform, which did not remain in pure and passive phenomenologies. This has been made to me by Juan David Garcia Baca, who is also a formidable stylist. Will we philosophers be so unfortunate that we cannot go beyond phenomenologists, descriptors and descriptions of what is immediately given, and we cannot transubstantiate ourselves into immediate reality, in favor of the deep and causal reality? Theoretical, Practical, and Positive Humanism according to Marx, FCE, Mexico, 1965, p. 23. All the features of Marx's style that in this study they are analyzed, could be concentrated and expressed by means of a certain contemporary linguistic category which, by great coincidence, happens to have the same name as Marx's great concern, economics. The principle of economics has been introduced into linguistics by André Martinet. According to this principle, which is the principle of least effort, man only spends his strength to the extent that he can thereby achieve the goals he has set. Linguistic evolution is governed by the permanent antinomy between man's communication needs and his tendency to reduce his mental and physical activity to a minimum. What can be called, writes Martinet, the economy of a language is this permanent search for a balance between the communicative needs for, on the one hand, inertia of memory and articulatory inertia on the other hand, these last two in permanent conflict. The play of all these factors is limited by various taboos that tend to freeze the language, discarding all innovation that is too obvious. From this it follows that economics is the framework that must be adopted when one intends to understand the dynamics of language. It is common to all languages, explains Martinet, that they are an economic product of the conflict between the unlimited needs of communication and the limited physical and mental resources of man. C. A. Martinet, Elements de linguistique générale, Libre Iri Collin, Paris, 1960, ch. 6, 2, 6-5, and also the article Economia, in Linguistique, Guide Alphabetic, edited by A. Martinet, de Noël, Paris, 1969, pages 81 ff. It is a question, then, of understanding that every language is a system of forces in equilibrium, a tissue of tensions. Let us leave aside for now finding out which economic theory is involved here, if is or is not the equilibrio theory, and this constitutes its dynamics, its movement. It is evident that, from the point of view of style, this must essentially consist of the way in which the writer solves this problem of linguistic economy. It is not, as Martinet says, making economies in the ordinary sense of saving, although sometimes the principle of saving works, as occurs for example in the style of Azorin, or in that of the Frenchman Albert Camus. It is about spending the energy that should have been expended on each page, neither more nor less. Thus, To use Martinet's example, the redundancy is a linguistic phenomenon that most of the time, contrary to what is commonly believed, does not work as an economic linguistic waste, but on the contrary, as an additional expenditure of energy necessary for communication. In the ending of the verbs, I am, there is an indication of the person, I, which makes it redundant to say, I am. However, in Spanish the same thing is not communicated with I am as with I am. The additional expense has an expressive meaning. In other cases, of course, redundancy equals waste, as in the example of Antonio Machado, the customary events that occur in the street, to say what happens on the street. In the case of Marx we have a literary style that made constant use of this principle of linguistic economy. His metaphors constitute an additional expenditure of verbal energy intended for effective communication with the reader. There are many scientific writers who regard this additional expense as inappropriate and unreliable. It seems that their ideal is isolation and, certainly, there are those who feel a certain unhealthy pleasure in not being understood. For Marx, for whom practice was the ultimate criterion of knowledge, it was essential to communicate practically with the public, to be understood to the root in order to be able to practically influence the task of verandering or subversive transformation of the world. That is why he took so much care of his expressive economy. This is evident in his finished and polished works. Even the most insignificant examples and figures take on a certain meaning. I swim. When he tells us that exchange value makes all merchandise equal, the example he gives us is the following: in the contribution to the critique of political economy, a volume of propertius and 8 ounces of snuff can aspire to the same exchange value despite the disparity of the values of tobacco use and elegy. Going to look for the elegies of propertius would seem excessive, but in reality it is a linguistic economy resource, intended for the reader to understand that Allseitige in Tauserung or universal alienation that money achieves from the use values of things. To talk about mercantile fetishism, he begins with formulas that would horrify any serious economist, such as saying that merchandise is presented in the bourgeois world as physically metaphysical objects, sinnlich übersinnlich. However, this is pure expressive economics. He fights against all linguistic parsimony or stinginess. Political order. This economic principle works in the same way in the dynamics of Marx's language. As will be seen in this essay, especially in 2.2, Marx constructed his sentences consciously seeking a certain balance of antagonistic forces of character verbal, intended to reproduce or express certain real antagonists. In other words, he adapted his signs to their meanings with the utmost minuteness. Citing. If in any part of Marx's dialectic is manifested in this linguistic game so frequent in him, through which he presents us with an affirmation in a certain number of words and then denies it with the same number of words but inverting their syntactic order, and finally without tether it all in one final sentence. The reader will find here examples of the various stylistic variants that this procedure acquired in Marx. It is one of the secrets of the roundness of many of his sentences, which unfortunately has allowed them to circulate from hand to hand like coins until they wear out and lose their original shine. This, however, is not an objection for Marx, since after all, his ultimate purpose was to carry out his own negation as intellectual, the reabsorption of his work in the people for whom it was destined. The principle of economy reads thus: man does not spend his forces except on extent to which it can achieve the goals it has set for itself. This is the principle of economy seen by a linguist. Now, Marx told us in a famous passage where he defined his global conception of society, humanity it never proposes anything other than the goals it can achieve. Is anyone, then, surprised that Marx thought that human society is a fundamentally economic society? A society never expires before having developed all the productive forces it is capable of. Counting the same is true of language. No language expires, except in cases of violent death, before having developed all its expressive possibilities. But if this is always the case on the social and historical plane, it is not always the same on the individual plane. Just as each individual has to make an effort to transform history without waiting for some historical fate to lead and move him, in the same way every writer has to make an effort to exhaust his expressive possibilities, his economic linguistic possibilities of communication, without wait for some destination to take care of making it understandable. It is the only possible solution to the eternal theoretical conflict between historical necessity and individual freedom. This conflict does not exist at the level of the individual writer. Whoever does not exercise his creative freedom to the maximum in language cannot expect that any historical necessity will make him a great writer, just as history does not make those who gave him the opportunity to become great. Back. If what is proper today is to overcome Marx by doing it, and not congeal him in a taboo by repeating his phrases over and over again, this is the case because Marx developed his own creative productive forces to the maximum. He developed his expressive economy to the limit of his own possibilities. L.S. Caracas, April 1971. Yo. The literary origin of Marx. Marx was not all his life a social scientist. It only really began to be so from the years 1843 to 44, a time in which Lassalle's characterization of him in 1851, in a letter to Marx, dated May 12, would have fitted him better, when he told him that Hegel became an economist. Before that, he had been a political and philosophical writer. And before these things, he had been a poet. As with many social scientists, Marx began as a literary man. This background becomes especially important when one tries to examine the fundamental features of the literary expression of his mature scientific work, that is, when one studies the letter of his scientific spirit, his peculiar way of expressing with vivacity and formal splendor the most complicated economic problems. Auguste Cornu has narrated with great detail and delicacy the vicissitudes of that early period of the young Marx, one when he assured his father that he was the owner of a very defined literary and poetic vocation, and wrote feverish poems in addition to engage in all kinds of aesthetic and mythological studies. But Marx was wrong, and he realized it. Some time later, his real vocation was not literature as such, although it was a writer's vocation. He was helped in this by his own father, who with great benevolence, but also with great precision, suggested that his vocation was not exactly poetic. He wrote Heinrich Marx to his son Karl at the beginning of 1836. I do not hide from you that, although I am deeply glad for your poetic gifts, of which I hope very much, it would afflict me to see you become a minor poet. Heinrich Marx was a very cultured man, a great reader of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Lessing, and exerted considerable influence on his son. Not so his mother, Henriette, whose spirit Cornu describes as closely practical. How could a mother who, towards the end of her days, ridiculed her son for having dedicated himself to writing capital instead of having dedicated himself to making a capital, have influenced Marx? She also influenced Marx, and to a large extent shaped his literary taste, his brother-in-law, the Baron de Westphalen. It was to him that Marx later dedicated his doctoral dissertation on the natural philosophy of Epicurus and Democritus. The Baron de Westphalen could read Latin and Greek fluently, and he undoubtedly participated in the birth, in Marx, of the admiration for the Greek language, which never waned in him and even became an instrument for fabricating ironies against echoes. Bourgeois nomists, since these Marx tells Engels in a letter from the years of Capital, necessarily had to be scandalized by a treatise on economics where Shakes was quoted. Peer and Homer, Marx's favorite poets, with the aggravating circumstance of being the latter quoted in Greek, this would offend their economic esprit du sérieux and would give them a new argument to brand Marx's work as metaphysical, literary, and ideological. Epithets, especially the latter, that resonate today in certain scientific sociologists. The lie wrapped in such adjectives reveals, however, like all lies, a certain truth, and that is that the author of Capital was certainly a very extravagant economist, who moved with such certainty in the field of empirical data. More concrete and detailed, as in that of the finest and most complicated abstractions. An example of the former is the magisterial chapter on machinery and large industry, where the most detailed description of a clockwork mechanism is offered, whatever the case may be, and various machinery is broken down piece by piece. An example of the capacity for abstraction is the first chapter, on merchandise, a true literary model of synchronic analysis. On the other hand, the extravagance of Marx that has always irritated bourgeois scientists is the combination of scientific objectivity with the indignant and combative denunciation of social contradictions and the disguised interests of political economy. Finally, it is astonishing that Marx accomplished in his own scientific personality what he considered a basic condition of desalienation, the overcoming of the division of labor. He was not a pure economist, nor a pure sociologist, nor a pure philosopher, nor a pure literalist, nor a pure politician. He was a complete social scientist, who did not would find an exact place in any of the specialized departments of modern universities, just as it never found a place in the German universities of his time, full of smug and grumpy academics who regarded, he humorously says, dialectic like the scourge of the bourgeoisie. Let's go back to his early years. At the age of 17, he writes Reflections of a Young Man on the Choice of a Career, where he expresses, among other things, that we cannot always embrace the career to which our vocation calls us. The situation we occupy within society already begins, in a certain way, before we can determine it ourselves. This turned out to be a great truth about Marx himself. Not only did he fail in what he believed to be his vocation, literature, he also abandoned the profession that his father wanted for him, jurisprudence. Before he determined his vocation, the student social environment in which he moved gradually and imperceptibly exerted an influence that determined his true vocation in him, law, social science, although still under the sign of politics and philosophy. In his ref/ions he had also written, the most dangerous professions for a young person are those that, instead of integrating him into life, deal with abstract truths. Here is a first announcement of the future fight against ideologies. In October 1835, Marx navigated the Mo. Seal it towards Koblenz. From there he takes a steamer that takes him to Bonn, where he arrives on October 17 of that year. He enrolls in the university the same day he arrives. His father's instructions indicated the advisability of following legal subjects, and also physics and chemistry, which is still a bit strange. Marx wanted to enroll in 9 courses, but his father convinced him to take only 6, in view of a possible sermonage. Heinrich Marx did not yet have to know that his son Karl was, as he himself said years later, a machine to devour books, or as Ruge put it in a letter to Feuerbach dated May 15, 1844, when he said that Marx's readings were a bottomless ocean. Note the composition of the table of subjects chosen by Marx. Puggy, Encyclopedia of Law Bocking, Institutions Walter, History of Roman Law Welker, Mythology of the Greeks and Romans Schlegel, Questions about Homer D. Alton, History of Modern Art. On law, only 3 subjects, and not a shadow of courses on physics and chemistry. Instead, 3 artistic literary subjects. None of these choices was useless for Marx. When, together with Engels, he criticized the legal ideology of society, or when he established his position on the alienation of the state, he moved with very different concepts. Concrete, learned in youth. Likewise, his mature fondness for metaphors using ancient literature, his examination, in the grand risks, of mythology as an expression of man's non-dominion over nature and, in short, the brilliance of his style, speak of a very rooted and deep classical training. This classical formation is important to our business. There is currently a tendency to devalue the famous classical training. There is an objective reason that justifies this tendency. The classical formation has been for centuries the metropolitan spearhead of Western culture, which, behind beautiful lace, hides evils such as racism, colonialism, imperialism. That culture was the ingenious and genius invention of capitalism. Ingenious, because in the same way as world trade arose and the universalization of economic relations under a mercantile pattern, a universal culture also arose, some universal ideological values. Capitalism was born believing itself to be eternal, and it believes so even more strongly than ever. It needed a culture that, despite its historical and concrete character, a small part of universal history, would conceive and announce itself as eternal, as culture par excellence. Great, because he has produced great works. Material slavery never prevented the emergence, within itself, of imaginative beauty. However, the classical formation has, like all human formations, its positive aspects. Indeed, there is nothing wrong with the study of classical languages and the literature of antiquity. To condemn them for the fact that they are usually accompanied by an ideology is to confuse things. It is perfectly conceivable, in a socialist society, the dedication to these studies. To suppress them according to the tendency is to fall into the most unfortunate quid pro quo. In Marx, for example, the classical training had excellent results, particularly with regard to his style as a writer. To what extent can this training influence the style of a writer? It is a difficult question, but not impossible to answer. Whoever answers it has to do it with his own experience. Anyone who has studied a dead language in depth, Greek, for example, in whose study Marx excelled, has learned to know better the secrets of living languages. The fact of giving theoretical life to a historically dead language in each translation exercise has a creative consequence with respect to the living language, especially the mother tongue. It induces the astonishment that it is and is alive, living there in front of one, in the mouths of men, the astonishment that it stretches itself voluptuously like breathing itself, that it leaps from the fence of teeth, Homer, and stretches out before us its syntactic articulations like an organism full of breath, exempt from all academic sclerosis, free from grammar. I lived as empty and triumphant as an animal. This serves, as a microscopic analysis of a dead structure, to give a structural reason for what is alive and to discover, at the bottom of the opulence of living language, the luminous logical skeleton. It serves, ultimately, to cultivate in the spirit of a writer the admiration and joy in front of his own instrument. Without this free admiration and joy, it is impossible to achieve a single page in which, along with scientific soundness, verbal perfection, the right twist, the right image, the illuminating metaphor, are added. The participation of classical studies in the formation of Marx's literary style is unquestionable. When these studies are really useful, their usefulness is not reduced to erudition, much less to the function of alleged eternal models. On the contrary, their true value is what they achieve in writers like Marx, to create in them a deep awareness of the living language, a gratuitous taste for expressive perfection, for the roundness of sentences. Valery said that this was the function of the study of Greek, and Unamuno said it with respect to Latin. Marx's precocious mastery of his own language, revealed in the verbal splendor of his youthful writings, particularly those that received the last coat of polish to go to print, as opposed to those that remain sketchy, a stylistic dichotomy that persists throughout Marx's lifetime, is due in large part to the linguistic formative effect of his classical studies. The first stylistic module of him was the metaphorical abundance. According to Cornu, the corrector of the aforementioned reflections noted that the dissertation revealed a great wealth of ideas, but that the excessive search for metaphors sometimes impaired the clarity of thought and the correctness of style. The rest of his life, Marx. He had to constantly self-control this fondness for metaphor, of which there are brilliant traces in works such as Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Poverty of Philosophy, Wage Labor and Capital, Critique of Political Economy, and Capital. Economic science, with its imperative for precision and analysis, would often act as a moderating, balancing force in this stylistic process. As a result, there would remain an irresistible metaphorical power controlled by and at the service of the scientific theoretical framework. And more profoundly, what we can call theoretical imagination would remain as a constitutive element of Marx's science, a sort of scientific inspiration that, aided by formal precision, was always capable of going beyond social appearances toward structures, and always beyond the theoretical postulates of political economy, towards its ideological springs. Marx, as we were saying, began by believing himself to be a poet. There are two kinds of reasons by which one can easily prove that such a vocation was never deep or true, although it undoubtedly contributed to the formation of his prose, since nothing forms prose so much as the initial practice of verse. A prose itself often consists of crouching verses. First of all, Marx's poems were touchingly bad. Literally in despair over Jenny's refusal to answer her outbursts until her engagement was official, Marx fills 3 notebooks with poems, which he sends to his girlfriend at Christmas. 1836, they were the Book of Songs, Buch der Lieder, and the Book of Love, Buch der Liebe. Tem. He also wrote some sarcastic epigrams and, in 1837, some chapters of a novel, Scorpion und Felix, as well as the first scenes of a drama in verse, Ulanem. The poems for Jenny have been valued by Mering in this way that leaves no doubt. They are totally amorphous in every sense of the term. The technique of the verse is totally primitive, and if the date on which they were written were not known exactly, no one could suppose that they were written a year after the death of Platon, and 9 after the publication of Heine's Book of Songs. On the other hand, there is nothing in its content to suggest it. They are nothing more than romantic sounds of the harp, the song of the elves, the song of the gnomes, the song of the sirens, the songs to the stars, the song of the bell ringer, the last song of the poet, the pale maiden, the cycle of the ballads of Albino and Rosamunde. 7 As for the novel, which Marx subtitled A Novel of Humor, it consisted of nothing but crude jokes and aggressive biting. In his book Marx, Engels, and the Poets, Peter Demetz makes it clear that the dilettante wanted too much. Wanting to imitate all the virtues of Stern, Jean-Paul, Hippel, and E.T.A. Hoffmann in a single work, his effort was necessarily lacking of order, force, and effect. Marx recognized his own failure and, to redo it, wrote his drama Ulanem, which, according to Demetz's own apostrophe, followed scrupulously. Mind the conventions of the usual genre of Gothic-style adventures. What is most saved from all this literary disaster, which, on the other hand, when recognized as such, left a healthy and positive mark on Marx, and cured him of literature, are the epigrams, in which one notices a clearly influenced by the famous Xenia_s by Goethe and Schiller, 1797. They are directed against Hegel. Through the effective resource of the ascending hexameter and the descending pentameter, and the rapid cut between them, he tried to represent the dialectical movement. Worth a brief example. Weil ich die Hochgesaint entdeckt und die Tiefsinnend gefunden, bin ich grob, wie ein Gott, hul mich in Dunkel, wie Lang Orsch und Trieb auf dem Wagenden Meer, der Gedanken, und de fand ich Word, halt am gefundenen, est. In the verses that follow, these are some of the first manifestations of what, as we will see, will constitute a fundamental feature of his expressive style, the game of contrasts, a kind of literary dialectic of opposites. He says, for example, und was Sinner, erkennt, 9 Peter Demetz, Marx, Engels und die Dichter, Stuttgart, 1959, chapter Rn. 0 Since I have discovered the highest and, meditating, found the deep, crude I am like a god, and, like him, I hide in, vanity. Long time have I searched sailing in the furious, sea of thought, I found there the word, and I clung to my find. Und was follett, sind 1 degree or, in a verse that recalls a certain phrase of St. John of the Cross. Als sag ich ja, weil ich nix /1 gesagt. Slow literary and poetic gifts. Indeed, he would become a great writer who can be compared to Lessing and Nietzsche for the precision and force of style, for the dazzling beauty of his metaphors, for his delicate sense of poetry, which later made him in the feared and loved counselor of great poets like Heinrich Heine and F. Freilagrath. But his soul was then too restless and tormented, his imagination too feverish. 12. But perhaps the most appropriate and accurate judgment about his literary origins is the one expressed by Marx himself in a letter to his father, dated November 10, 1837 in Berlin, which reveals a rapid recovery from the syndrome, since somewhat anachronistic at that time, of the literary Sturm und Drang, in the disposition of spirit in which I found myself then. My first literary production, at least the one that was most agreeable to me and the one that immediately offered itself to me, was lyric poetry, and, as the situation in which I found myself and my whole intellectual development required, this poetry was purely idealistic. My heaven and my art were an ideal as distant as my love. A reality that is diluted and dissipated into infinity, accusations against the present times, vague and confused feelings, a total lack of naturalness, misty constructions, an absolute opposition between the ideal and reality, rhetoric and reasoning instead of poetic inspiration, and, perhaps, a certain warmth of feelings and a certain effort oriented towards lyrical flight. It is still symptomatic of the life and intellectual style of a man who was characterized by radical and total criticism of his contemporaries, having begun with such an accurate and incisive criticism of himself. And, finally, there was a second type of reason that made it possible to suspect his literary vocation. Arriving in Bonn, Marx enrolled in a young poets' club, readings, recitals. But what was really the activity of this unique club, given that shortly after it was raided by the political police? 2. Fundamental features of the style. From Marx. The previous pages have helped us to situate the origin of Marx as a writer, his initiation and failure as a poet, which, however, was not a waste of time, since the best school for prose is usually verse, as far as this requires a deepening of the plastic and rhythmic qualities of the language itself, the prosody itself, his classical aesthetic linguistic training, which contributed decisively to his mastery of linguistic structure, his early fondness for metaphorical idealization, which over time would transform into the opportune metaphorization of ideas, in short, his self-criticism as a writer, which led him to end before he was 20, and even before starting out as a social scientist, in his definitive literary form of expression, in the intellectual style that was always his own. Now we will try a completely different point of view. Taking Marx's work as an expressive whole, sort of a vast theoretical score, we will try to isolate some of the basic features that constitute his literary and intellectual style. The first stylistic trait, which at the same time is the most general of all, can be baptized as the architecture of science, or else, the scientific work as a work of art. We take the word architectural in the precise sense that Kant gave it, in the final pages of his Critique of Pure Reason, Transcendental Theory of Method, Chapter 3, Architectural of Pure Reason. Whichever position one adopts regarding Kant's work, no one can sensibly deny at least two things: that it is a rationalist monument, and that it is strewn with precious methodological observations, many of which remain fully valid as far as they are concerned. Such an example of both things is the section dedicated to the architecture of pure reason. Kant says there, "By architecture I understand the art of systems, die Kunst der Systeme." Since systematic unity is what converts the vulgar knowledge in science. Architecture is, then, the theory of what is scientific in our knowledge in general, and it necessarily belongs to methodology. To be realized, the idea needs of a schema, that is, of a diversity and an ordering of the parts that are essential and determined a priori according to the principle of the end or goal. The schema that is not outlined according to an idea, that is, according to a capital end of reason, but on the contrary it is empirically, following aims that are accidentally presented. Gives us a technical unity, but the scheme that reflects result of an idea. Founds an architectural unit, architektonisch Einheit. What we call science cannot be technically founded, but architecturally. 11 * The art of systems. What is scientific in our knowledge becomes such thanks to a systematic, architectural unity, in which all the parts respond to each other, and in which none is true except with respect to the whole. It is the same thing that contemporary structuralism calls the logical priority of the whole over the parts, only that in Kant the a priori was logical transcendental and not merely logical. If we leave aside the transcendental implication, we are left with a perfectly valid methodological scheme. Architecture is the art of systems, says Kant. In what he coincides, and not by chance, with a great poet, Paul Valéry, who spoke of the plus poétique des idées, l'idée de composition, undoubtedly following his no less great teacher Mallarmé, for whom each verse was a score, a minimal orchestra in which, to say it with the master of all, Baudelaire, les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répondent, they are architectural correspondences. Thus, the general method of science and the general method of art coincide in this idea: to have science, and to have art, there must be architecture. Thought, to be science, must be systematic; the expression, to be artistic, it must be architectural, governed by the art of systems. And if science implies architecture, and architecture implies art, then science implies art. Logical bone of this reasoning: if P implies Q, and Q implies R, then P implies R, simple and clear law of transitivity. Material bone of reasoning: if a structural condition of science is its architectural character, and if its architectural character is equally a structural condition of art, then science and art have at least one structural condition that is the same. What in the formalized expression is a variable, R, becomes a constant in the non-formalized expression, the architectural character. Is it any wonder then that what is architectural in a scientific system is at the same time what is beautiful in it? For Karl Marx it was a true obsession throughout his life to build an economy that had an architectural appearance and structure, and it creates in him conscious the fact that it should achieved in the same way as an artistic work is achieved. And not only in relation to the general form of the scientific building, its broader and more general structural lines, also with regard to the small details, the expressive moldings, the trimming of the sentences, the curved and firm nerve of the verbal vaults, the metaphorical ricamato, the conceptual pilasters and, finally, the foundations of scholarship. Faced with Engels's insistence on seeing the first volume of Capital published once and for all, Marx wrote to him, "I can't make up my mind to send nothing for the printer before seeing everything finished. Whatever their defects may be, the advantage of my works is that they form an artistic whole, which can only be achieved by my method of never letting them go to print before they are finished." Marx to Engels, July 31, 1865. Note how Marx himself underlines the artistic and perfect whole that his works had to be before going to print. What we now call Marx's work is divided into two great halves, the one that went to print, life of the author, and the one that remained in the state of an unfinished manuscript. The first is the only one that can be considered, if we respect Marx's own literary and scientific criteria, as finished. It is the one that received the definitive learn of style, what Ortega called the last pumice stone rubbing that tersifies and buffs. The second half must be considered stylistically imperfect, unfinished, truncated, always guiding us by Marx's criteria. Was Marx right? From an architectural point of view, it is evident that he was right. There is a stylistic gulf between works such as the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, published in 1859, and the Grundrisse, written between 1857 and 1858. The comparison is all the more appropriate if we think of the critique as a result of the investigations carried out in the Grundrisse. At the time when he was writing these, Marx asked La Salle to find him a publisher for his critique of the bourgeois economy and capitalist society, always the old and gigantic project, painfully dragged on since 1844. La Salle found the publisher Franz Duncker, who offered to pay Marx a handsome fee, which illuminated the latter's terrible misery. Months go by and La Salle does not receive the manuscript. Having expressed to Marx, in a letter of October 22, 1858, the impatience of the editor, he replies that, apart from misery and liver diseases, concerns of style slow him down. Liver crises, he says, leave his trace in the style of the work. On the other hand, he explains, since it is a work that focuses for the first time and in a scientific way on an important construction of social relations, its form must be perfect, its literary expression must be consistent with the new conception. Only about 8 months later the critique will appear published. Despite having at hand his manuscript of the Grundrisse, of impressive quantitative and qualitative magnitude, Marx wrote a new work, the Critique. Gone was the other manuscript, forever unfinished. The reading of both works is very different, which proves the truth of what Marx affirmed to Engels in the aforementioned letter. There are notable differences in style between one and the other. The Grundrisse are replete with enormously long sentences, strewn with dozens of paragraphs, parentheses, obscurities, arbitrary mixtures of languages, and other features that make it difficult to read, despite an equal number of brilliant passages. Stylistically strong and clear. There is visible the hand of a man who, harassed by the most atrocious misery, bread and potatoes most of the time, according to Marx, was forced during the day to write newspaper articles by way of paid work, and that only at night did he find some space to dedicate himself to what he called his real work. He wrote feverishly until 4 in the morning, greedy for a time that was running out, and certainly without the peace and humor necessary to lovingly polish what he wrote or, better, what he expelled from his brain in gushes. The criticism is, stylistically, something else. Existential misery was the same, but at least writing the critique was promised a fee, so he could dedicate his salaried labor time to it and convert it into scientific and literary value-creating time. Marx was thus able to concentrate on this. He brings to bear all his gifts as a writer. In this way he achieved a poignant, incisive, ironic style, with rounded and polished sentences, in conscious counterpoint with conceptual precision, that is to say, full union of the literary sign and the scientific meaning. One can sit down to read criticism, the Grundrisse, one has to sit down and study them. These are a brilliant draft, but a draft, that one, on the other hand, is one of the most perfect models that exists of scientific literature, of science understood as a work of art, of scientific architecture. The same difference goes, as we will see later, of works such as Hegel's Critique of the Philosophy of Right to the manuscripts of 44, or of Volume I of Capital at theories of surplus value. All this means that we cannot consider Marx's work as architecturally perfect, in the sense in which we consider, for example, the Divine Comedy. However, if we abandon the point of view of total perspective, and stick to partial perspectives, then we can speak of a large half of Marx's work that is architecturally exemplary and stylistically complete. That part is made up of the works that he was able to publish during his lifetime. In any case, Marx's plan was always architectural. In his edition of the works of Marx, Maximilian Rubel has masterfully reconstructed the architecture of that economy that Marx always projected, beginning in 1844, the time of the first drafts. The vastness of the project made it so that Marx periodically abandoned it. Especially in the miserable years of 1851 to 56, although he always promised to do so in letters. Marx aspired to produce a scientific work in which all aspects of his conception of history were studied, those that he explained schematically in the famous prologue to the Critique of 1859, both the structural aspects of the social building, Struktur, and the appearance of the building itself, Überbau. 6 books, of which he only finished 1. All the biographers who are accustomed to speak of the fate or predestination of their characters should know that, in the case of Marx, there was no predestination at all. Had there been, he would doubtless have taken care that Marx did not suffer so much acute misery, so much liver failure, so many boils, so much journalism, so many creditors that forced him to hide like a hunted animal in Engels's house, and would have allowed, so he concluded and finished many more works than he could finish, and made many more parts of the vast architectural structure that he always aspired to build. What we have called the architectural character of Marx's intellectual style is, so to speak, a structural feature, which belongs to his work taken as a whole and viewed in perspective. Now let us invert the point of view and look closely at the verbal flesh that fills and encourages, like a living mass of cells, all that structural skeleton. Thus a new feature appears, perhaps the fundamental one of Marx's style. Stated in the manner of the latter, the feature can be outlined as the dialectic of the expression, or, what is the same for the case, the expression of the dialectic. Marx is a materialist dialectician not only for having isolated, as he said, the rational nucleus one of the Hegelian dialectic, and for having applied it. Dedicated to the study of history under the criteria of the material relations of production, he is also one for having materialized the dialectic in a literary style that is the most perfect expression of the logical historical movement in which the dialectic consists. No one, to our knowledge, has noticed something that is nevertheless plain to see, namely that Marx consciously sought to express, through certain peculiarities of his literary style and through a specific verbal movement, the actual movement itself to which he refers. Their writings are worth it. Speaking in semantic syntactic terms, the formal and logical relationships into which Marx makes verbal signs enter, constitute a plastic gesticulation destined to reflect the material and historical relationships of meanings. The rational nucleus of the dialectic resides in the formula, of Heraclitan lineage, of the coincidentia oppositorum, the clash of opposites that produces a synthetic result. But Marx's dialectic cannot be understood at all if we remain in that formulation. In pure logic, the negation of the negation is nothing more than a plain and simple affirmation. If we say, not, p, what we are really saying is simply p. It is like, in mathematics, writing, 2 to 2, plus 2 equals 2. In Marx, this rational core is nothing more than a general pattern to theoretically express a real and historical movement. As a general guideline, it may work, but only as long as we don't intend to use it with absolute logical precision. There is not, nor do we believe there can be, a logical formulation of actual dialectical motion that is materially adequate and formally correct. Tarski. Thus, for example, although it is materially appropriate, from the point of view of the classical theory of truth as adequatio or correspondence, to say, as Marx says, that of the clash of antagonistic historical opposites, haves and dispossessed, owners and expropriated, a historical, real synthesis can be produced, whose future model is the communist society in its superior phase. However, if we wanted to express such an idea from a strictly logical and formally correct point of view, we could not say that of the clash of contradictories a synthesis produces. We would have to speak at least of a relation of conjunction between contradictories, that is, P and not P, but no dialectical synthesis results from this, since logical contradiction produces nothing, or, as Popper has reminded us, produces anything. The value of the implication relation, represent all by dash, will always be tautological, always true, whatever the value of the variable we put in place of the question mark. In logic, contradiction does not work dialectically. But this is not to say, as Popper mistakenly wants, that there are not historically real opposites that can produce a synthesis. It can be granted that it is not appropriate to speak, stricto sensu, of social contradictions, but it is appropriate to speak of antagonism. Marx sometimes says Widerspruch and others, Gegensatz. Which only proves that, in Marx's plan, the rigid application of Hegelian logical schemes to history did not figure. His poverty of philosophy overwhelmingly proves it, since this would be equivalent to assuming in Marx precisely the Proudhonian ideology according to which history is governed by the idea or ideas, the principles, and not vice versa. What Marx does is point out the laws that concretely preside over the synthesis and future overcoming of social antagonisms. As Mondale has seen *degree today's society already offers several concrete preconditions that announce the synthesis. Poverty of Philosophy is a work in part dedicated specifically to destroying the Proudhonian illusions of directly applying Hegelian logical categories to political economy. From such an application, Marx explained, there could only result a monstrosity, the metaphysics of political economy, which ideologically hid nothing other than the idealization and eternalization of capitalist material conditions, that is, the metaphysical apology of the system. Marx, who wrote that work in French so that Proudhon could understand him, says, Inzi, tu sce dans cette méthode absolue? L'abstraction du mouvement. Tu sce que l'abstraction du mouvement? Le mouvement à l'état abstrait. Tu sce que le mouvement à l'état abstract? La formule purement logique du mouvement ou le mouvement de la raison pure. En quoi consiste le mouvement de la raison pure? ASE poser, ASE poser, ASE composer, ASE formular comme these. These, synthese, ou bien encore ASE affirmer, ASE near, a near SA negation. Comment fait-elle, la raison, pour SA affirmer, pour SE poser en catégorie déterminée? C'est l'affaire de la raison elle-même et de SES apologists. Thus, the dialectical movement, in its strictly logical formulation, is nothing other than an abstraction, an abstract movement without any correspondence to the peculiar philosophy of history, which claims to think of a reality in perfect correspondence with logical schemes, becomes, says Marx ironically, a plain and simple history of philosophy, ideological history, and it camotes precisely everything that can be of interest. Hence the attack on Proudhon and his work System de Contradictions, a vain attempt to apply Hegelian logical categories, which he did not understand well, for which reason Marx saw fit to explain them to him, directly to political economy. Proudhon made the same blunder that the Commissars philosophers of Marxism make today, who stand pre-Dorian-guard around the three laws of dialectic and turn Marx into the most defiant Hegelian idealist. Without a doubt, they have not read well the unambiguous passages of Miseria de la Philosophia. The dialectic was not, for Marx, a logical method properly, it was a historical method. For a logical method to be formally correct, its first condition is its emptiness, but Marx was interested precisely in the fullness of history, in its multiple concretization. Admettance with M. Proudhon que l'histoire réelle, one histoire selon l'ordre de temps, est la succession historique dans laquelle les idées, les catégories, les principes se sont manifestes. Chaque principe eu son siècle pour sy manifester, le principe d'autorité, par exemple, eu le 11 siècle, de même que le principe d'individualisme le 18 siècle. De conséquence en conséquence, c'était le siècle qui appartenait au principe, et non le principe qui appartenait au siècle. En d'autres termes, c'était le principe qui faisait l'histoire, ce n'était pas l'histoire qui faisait le principe. This fragment is so explicit that it is worth quoting at length, not only because it is common proves our statements, but because it serves as a perfect illustration of the stylistic feature that we will try to define. Marx continues, lorsque, ensuite, pour sauver les principes autant que l'histoire, on se demande pourquoi tel principe est manifeste dans le x1 degré ou dans le 15 degré siècle plutôt que dans tel autre, on est nécessairement forcé d'examiner minutieusement quels étaient les hommes du 11 siècle, quels étaient sur du 18 asterisk, quels étaient leurs besoins respectifs, leurs forces producers, leur mode de production, les matières premières de leur production, enfin quels étaient les rapports d'hommes qui résultaient de toutes ces conditions d'existence. Approfonder toutes ces questions, nsce pas faire l'histoire réelle, profane de hommes in chaque siècle, représenter ces hommes à la fois comme les auteurs et les acteurs de leur propre drame. Mais du moment que vous représentez les hombres mais comme les acteurs et les auteurs de leur propre histoire, vuits, par un détour, arrive. Au ventable point de départ, then you have abandoned the princes itmals dont vous parliez d'abord. This digression on the dialectic was necessary precisely to avoid being attributed to me from the outset a Proudhonian attempt to literally mystify the dialectic. When I say that Marx's style is a living expression of his dialectic, I do not mean to say something very profound, nor am I suggesting the rigid and mysterious existence of logical schemes implicit in Marx's sentences, nor do I affirm the presence in them of some mythological Hegelian spirit. I am only referring to a simple stylistic trait that was, by all accounts, fully conscious in Marx. The very name dialectical that I give to Marx's style is not a strictly logical name. But this does not imply that there are no objective reasons for calling it that way. The literary secret of roundness and the forcefulness of numerous phrases of Marx is the very secret of his dialectical conception of history as a class struggle or struggle of opposites. In his sentences it is very common to find a syntactic structure in which two opposites appear clearly drawn in antagonistic correlation, which usually end up fused into a synthetic sentence. We have just seen it in some sentences of the quoted text, for example. C'était le siècle qui appartenait au principe, et non le principe qui appartenait au siècle. In d'autres terms, c'était le principe qui faisait l'histoire, ce n'était pas l'histoire qui faisait le principe. The literary secret that governs these constructions, frequent in great prose writers and especially in great poets, Petrarca and Garcilaso, for example, consists of first formulating a sentence, and making it follow a second in which what is said. Inverse but using the same words in an inverted syntactic relationship, and often, ending with a third sentence where, also with the same words but adding some others, a synthesis of the previously established antagonistic correlations is made. When we speak of correlations we think of the literary theory of correlations, devised by the Spanish philologist Damaso Alonso and by his disciples such as Carlos Busano, according to which, in many classic and modern poems, there is a scheme of metaphorical correlations, which consists of first naming a series of objects, then naming a series of metaphorical correspondents of those same objects and, finally, bringing them all together the objects and their correspondences in a final sentence of a synthetic nature. The same is often the case with Marx's sentences, which for this reason often give the impression of stylistic roundness, only that in Marx this feature is concretized as a game of conceptual opposites reflected in a game of verbal and syntactic opposites, so it is not wise to baptize such a feature as genuinely dialectical. Observe, for example, the following fragment from the manuscripts of 44. We wordy der Arbeiter dem Produkt seiner Tätigkeit fremd gegenübertreten können, wenn im Anit der Produktion selbst sich nicht selbst entfremdet, das Produkt ist ja nur das Resümee der Tätigkeit, der Produktion. Wenn also das Produkt der Arbeit die Entäußerung ist, so muss die Produktion selbst die tätige Entäußerung, die Entäußerung der Tätigkeit, die Tätigkeit der Entäußerung sein. In der Entfremdung des Gegenstands der Arbeit resümiert sich nur die Entfremdung, die Entäußerung in der Tätigkeit der Arbeit selbst. How could the worker face the product of his activity as a stranger, if in the very act of production he did not alienate himself? The product is nothing more than the summary of the activity, of the production. If, therefore, the product of labor is alienation, production itself is active alienation, the alienation of activity, the activity of alienation. In the alienation of the object product of labor, alienation is only summed up, the alienation of the activity of labor itself. For we have tried to preserve in the translation the features of Marx's own style, as well as his elaborate and precise puns that are, of course, much more than just games. Although we believe that it is necessary to unify the vocabulary and call alienation, as the French Marxists do, the reality designated by man, through three words that alternate in his youthful writings, in his mature ones it almost always appears in Fremdung. In the present case, in order to preserve Marx's verbal play, we have had to translate Fremdung for alienation and Entäußerung for alienation, without this meaning establishing subtle differences between the Spanish terms. The feature that we tried to explain theoretically before is observed in the fragment. However, the opposites, they are not conceptual here, but merely verbal. To say the same thing, see how Marx expresses all the syntactic possibilities. The product of labor is alienation, production itself is active alienation, alienation of activity, activity alienation. Here is how a virtuous linguistic transit is carried out between the first determination of labor alienation, alienation from the product, and the second, alienation from productive activity. The conceptual transit is reflected through a formal caper of great expressive effectiveness. On the other hand, the aforementioned scheme of correlations that end up merging is observed. The key terms, product, alienation and production productive activity, begin by being raised interrogatively, then in the form of an affirmation and, finally, are summarized in the final phrase, in which the conceptual transition and formal is already consummated. The passage that follows the aforementioned one is equally significant, since in it the opposites at stake are clearly outlined and even linear. Let's try to graphically arrange such opposites, for the convenience of the reader. Worin bestet nun die what, then, does Intausierung der Arbeit consist of? The alienation of labor? Erstens, dass die Arbeit dem Arbeiter außerlich ist. First, that work is external to the worker. Dh nicht zu seinem Wesen gehört. Das sich der in seiner Arbeit nicht bejaht, which is therefore not affirmed in his work. Sondern verneint. Otherwise he refuses. Nicht weil, he does not feel happy, sondern unglücklich fühlt, but unhappy kein freie physische und geistige Energie entwickelt, does not develop free spiritual and physical energy. Sondern sein Physis abcastiert und seinen Geist of him ruiniert, but mortifies his body and ruins his spirit. Der Arbeiter fühlt sich daher erst außer der Arbeit bei sich. The worker is himself, only when he is out of work. Und in der Arbeit außer sich. And at work he feels beside himself. Zu Haus ist when nicht arbeitet. He is on his own, when he does not work. Und when arbeitet, ist nicht zu Haus. And when he works, he is not in his business. Seine Arbeit ist daher nicht freiwillig, his work is not voluntary. Sondern gezwungen, Zwangsarbeit, but forced labor. Sie ist daher nicht die Befriedigung eines Bedürfnisses. It is not the satisfaction of a need. Sondern sie ist nur ein Mittel, Bedürfnisse außer ihr zu befrieden. But only a means to satisfy needs outside of it. Wie in der Religion die Selbstständigkeit der menschlichen Fantasie, de menschlichen Hirns und de menschlichen Herzens unabhängig vom Individuum, dhals ihn fremd, gottlich oder teuflisch Tätigkeit, auf es Wort. Just as in religion the activity proper to human fantasy, the human mind and heart act on the individual independently of him, that is, as a strange, divine, or diabolical activity. So ist die Tätigkeit des Arbeiters nicht seine Selbsttätigkeit of him. Sie gehört zu einem anderen, sie ist der Verlust seiner del selbst. In the same way, the activity of the worker is not his own activity. It belongs to another, it is the loss of oneself. The quote could be prolonged, since this area of the 1944 manuscripts is littered with similar contrasts, all aimed at specifying the moral, psychological, and even physiological effects of the alienation of work. If alienation is, in its last root, a kind of esse, a self-doubling, a doubling, how else to express it stylistically if not through the doubling of sentences into sets of linear opposites? On the other hand, all this double situation must be synthesized stylistically, for this is the comparison with religion, very frequent in Marx, by the way, and for this there is also the comparison with animals, as if it were a question of portraying in man to a being torn intimately throughout the distance that goes from beast to gods. That is why he will say that the worker, who is a man, feels free in his animal functions, and feels animal in his human function. He feels free when he eats, drinks and sleeps, he feels animal when he works, therefore, in short, das Tierisk word das Menschliche und das Menschliche das Tierisk, the animal becomes the human, and the human becomes the animal. Similarly, man uses in the Sagrada Familia the same stylistic module to describe the antagonism of classes. If there is a real antagonism between the propertied and dispossessed classes, that antagonism must also be reflected verbally by opposites. Try the reader to read the following fragment in the same way as we read the one previously cited. A. The possessing class and the class of the proletariat represent the same human self-alienation. B. But the first class feels good and affirms itself in this self-alienation, knows that the alienation is its own power and possesses in it the appearance of a human existence. Expression of the 110 Akar 1 Ca 49, c. The second, on the other hand, feels destroyed and denied in the alienation, sees in it her impotence and the reality of an inhuman existence. The division into three parts is practiced to highlight the absolute stylistic precision and the game of correspondences. In A, the topic is introduced. In B, one finds feeling good, affirming oneself, own power, appearance, and human existence. In C, on the contrary, are found in perfect negative correspondence with B, feeling destroyed, denial, impotence, reality and inhuman existence. However, this game of opposites does not remain unchanged, but rather merges, is synthesized in the affirmation that both antagonistic aspects are part, ultimately, of the same human self-alienation. They form a whole, a social structure based on the antagonism of classes. It is like a sphere that contains two opposite poles. The private owner, says Marx in the same place, represents the action for the maintenance of that antithesis, while the proletarian represents the action for the destruction of the antithesis, a conservative force against a subversive force. We could add, following Mannheim, a realized ideology against a realizable utopia. Such is the real historical movement, full of contradictions whose development will constitute the dialectical solution of those same contradictions. Marx explains this theory in simple terms in Capital, when he writes, "We saw that the process of exchange of commodities contains aspects that contradict and exclude each other. The development of the commodity does not abolish these contradictions, what it does is create the way in which they can develop. There is no other procedure to resolve true contradictions. Thus, for example, the fact that one body is constantly attracted to another and constantly repelled by it, constitutes a contradiction. Well, the ellipse is one of the forms of movement in which this contradiction is realized at the same time as it is resolved. All of Marx's work is full of phrases like the ones analyzed above. It is the literary expression, artistically cared for to the maximum, of a thought that saw in capitalist society a breeding ground of objective contradictions, capital vs. work, appropriation vs. alienation, bourgeoisie vs. proletariat, ideology vs. class awareness, market needs vs. human needs, exchange value vs. use value, production relations vs. relations of destruction, social structure vs. social appearance, division of labor vs. division of the worker, socialization of production vs. private mode of appreciation, etc. The objective existence and discovery of these contradictions, which do not represent, as people like Popper imply to degree the forces of evil versus the forces of good, zero a conspiracy theory but simply, human history. Mana, the 7,000 years of exploitation, constitute the real reason why Marx's thought was dialectical. The dialectic in Marx is not a Hegelian super-reason implied in history, it is nothing more, and nothing less, than a rational method to approach history from the point of view of the class struggle and the relations of production. As we saw before in a text, it is not about explaining history through principles or ideas, but about explaining principles or ideas through history. Marx did not confuse the real and the rational, he was not the panlogist that those who want to make Marxist dialectic a method of explaining all matter and the universe have turned him into. The dialectic is nothing but the Marxist method for the study of history. His style was true to his thinking. Perhaps with the examples cited and analyzed we have been able to give an idea of this fundamental stylistic trait of Marx. The citations could be multiplied, but this is unnecessary in this essay, which only intends to suggest fields of study in this almost virgin aspect of Marx's work. What is certain is that the main feature of Marx's literary style is his elaborate, conscious correspondence with the conceptual contents. We have searched for the most perfect expression of such a correspondence in certain exemplary passages in which the dialectical game of opposites is clear and the sign-meaning correspondence is clearly drawn. However, this correspondence is expressed in the work of Marx in 1,000 different ways, although that one is the most notorious and constant. Marx knows how to adapt his style with infinite plasticity to his objects of study, and he preserves, throughout his work, a curious uniformity of vocabulary for the treatment of certain themes. Althusser says that in Capital it is possible to register the presence of a theoretical practice that, analyzed, would constitute the secret of Marxist dialectic and epistemology. One of the conditions for unraveling this theoretical practice is undoubtedly the analysis of Marx's literary form, which reflects with incredible precision the real, historical movements designated by the words he uses. In short, it is not a question of a style that is content with designating phenomena, it is a style that, moreover, represents them, acts them, as if the words suddenly became actors on a stage. Marx's language is, in this sense, the theater of his dialectic. In the Critylus, Plato wrote, From the point of view of the possible, the most beautiful language would be the one that used words that were all or for the most part, similar to objects, that is, appropriate, and the ugliest, otherwise. Degree. Throughout Marx's work one notices the periodic, constant appearance of some great metaphors, a sort of matrix metaphors that encompass all other literary figures and serve as a totality for them. They are the metaphors with which he illustrates his conception of history, and at the same time those that often serve him to formulate his relentless criticism of bourgeois ideologues and economists. It would take an entire volume to study in detail the main ones of these vast metaphors. Because they do not fulfill a purely literary or ornamental role, apart from their aesthetic value, they attain a cognitive value in Marx, as an expressive support for science. Those who believe that metaphors are not a source of knowledge are mistaken. They may not represent exact knowledge, but they do have cognitive value. The basis of all metaphor is an analogical reasoning, and since the time of Aristotle we know that we know many things by analogy, a term that he defined as equality of relations. Of phenomena, for example, between the lungs and the air, on the one hand, and the gills and the water, on the other, is to take a fundamental step in the study of these phenomena. In addition to these reasons, there are those that poets could use. Any appropriate metaphor increases the expressive power of language, and all science needs a powerful language of expression. Then, every suitable metaphor is an excellent companion to science, as well as suitable examples. Nietzsche said that metaphors and examples are sometimes everything to express a thought. Of the great metaphors of Marx examines. Here we will only consider three: 1. The metaphor of the superstructure, 2. The metaphor of reflection, and 3. The metaphor of religion. We could still point out others that are no less important. What is, for example, the famous commercial fetishism if not a gigantic metaphor, set like a diamond on the framework of a scientific theory, with the aim of making it more understandable and expressive? The theory according to which in capitalist society the fundamental social relations, which are human relations of production, appear as relations between things, and capital itself, which is nothing but a social relation, appears as a thing so decidedly mysterious that it is even capable of generating more capital, as occurs with usurious and banking capital in general, finds its perfect analogy in the primitive phenomenon of fetishism, whose essential feature involves the personification of a thing, the fetish, to which is delegated the power to dispose of life or death, and therefore, it also implies the reification of the person who prostrates himself before the fetish, fearful and in debt of his own life. Person, he is worth as merchandise. In turn, the merchandise produced by the worker becomes for him an authentic fetish to which he owes his life, that is, his livelihood. You take my life / when you do take the means whereby I live, says Shakespeare in a quote that Marx liked to do. It is what Marx called the alienation of the product, or its dominance over the producer. And, in general, economic life becomes the Empire 32, for example, in Das Kapital, ed. Cit. I. p. 511. Of things. Money is a social relationship, but it appears as a thing that dominates all social relationships. Time becomes gold, that is, currency or general equivalent. Indeed, labor time is the creator of monetary wealth. In turn, things become people, as soon as it begins to behave like a commodity, writes Marx at the beginning of Capital. The table becomes a physically metaphysical object. It not only stands on its legs on the floor, but it stands upside down in front of all the other merchandise, and from its wooden head cravings begin to emerge much more bizarre and strange than if the table suddenly broke into a dance of its own accord. In his fascinating work The Golden Branch, Fraser tells that on the island of Timor, East Indies, there are two types of chiefs, the first of them, the Raja Civil, a kind of civil chief, who is in charge of conducting political affairs, and the second, a chief fetish or Raja fetish, who is in charge, by chance, of everything related to the economy and the means of subsistence of the communities. In appearance and formally, the first of the chiefs is the most important, but in reality and materially speaking, it is the fetish chief who decides the truly important and vital matters, the basic matters, the economic matters. His main power is the ability to make anything taboo. Which, in these primitive peoples, it is a reality sans phrase, is what Marx metaphorically designates as fetishism in modern capitalist nations. In these there is a state that directs politics, and its functions are supposed to be the most important, but the really important and vital functions, the basic or economic functions, are governed by a chief fetish, capital, adorned with all its feathers and nuances of use value, exchange value, salary, labor power, monetary system, etc. The real name of the companies called anonymous is the capital they own, and it is a name that they cannot hide behind any anonymity, because it is their authentic name. The relations between capitalist X and capitalist W are not relations between people, but between capitals. This supreme modern fetish acquires so much personality that without the need for the direct presence of its owners, placed in a bank, it bears fruit and increases in interest. In the same way, the relations of production do not appear as relations between a capitalist and a worker, but as the relations existing between capital and a labor force converted into merchandise. That is why Marx said that capital employs labor. In turn, labor has produced capital, but it has produced it as the primitive manufactures his fetish, that is, as an object that henceforth, after being created and produced, will become the owner and lord of the creator or producer. We are not in a primitive state, so we cannot speak of real fetishism. However, there is no more appropriate metaphor than that of fetishism. To illustrate the true character of social relations existing in Marx's time and, in abundance, in ours. But let's go to the three great metaphors that we had promised to analyze. And let's be careful, because it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to separate them, as stylistic features, from an entire conceptual framework. 2.3.L. The superstructure as a metaphor. This subject offers, from the outset, a tremendous difficulty. Presenting as a metaphor, or more precisely, as an analogy that supports a great metaphor, a term that for the vast majority of Marxists, Marxologists, and Marxians is a complete scientific explanation, is something that easily sounds like heresy or bourgeois subtlety, intended to undermine the theoretical edifice of Marx. On the other hand, entering into a detailed polemic with a certain number, however small and select it may be, of the authors who see in the superstructure a scientific explanation and not a metaphor, would take us so far that we would have to distort completely the strict character of this essay on the style of Marx, to turn it into an essay on Marxist theory. However, there will be no choice but to make some inroads in this direction, among other reasons because in Marx, as in any other author of scientific theories, it is completely impossible to surgically separate the signs from the meanings. 0, as was said before with Ter. 58 imsus 1 equals unn/iman ray.es of the writing of mmx aestheticizing menology, separating the form from the content. There is a true literary style there where the signs are the most exact expression possible, plastically and musically, prosodically, of the meanings, that is, where there is no discrepancy or excess between the signs used and the meanings that have been wanted to be expressed. As Antonio Machado said, if one wants to say what happens in the street, one must say what happens in the street or something similar, for example, what happens in the street every day, but in no way must it be said, the events with customary events that take place in the street. In this last case there is discord or excessiveness, lack of concord between signs and meaning. There is no style, there is no exact incision of the verbal scalpel in the torso of the concept. If a writer like Marx has style, and a brilliant style, it is because in his prose signs and meanings go hand in hand, in balance of forces, and together they can perform all sorts of capers, like ideal athletes whose weight, strength, and movements are calculated with exactness, moving in aerial feats that, despite their audacity, do not contravene any of the laws of bodies, but rather play with them. What in cultist Spanish is usually called superstructure, sometimes transformed into its prestructura or, more sensibly, into superstructure. Marx designated it in two ways, sometimes, using the Latin etymology, says Superstruktur, other times, speaking in German, says Überbau, which literally comes to be the upper part, Über, of a building, consisting of MSCN/Mbismbr 1 equals or TS de Mar 59 truction or structure, Bau, although, from the architectural point of view, it is not proper to call the upper part of a building Überbau or superstructure, since it is, all of it, a single structure. Überbau actually designates the scaffolding or boards that are superimposed on a building as it is being built, but that logically disappear when the building is finished. An architecturally finished building is a structure, there is no trace of a superstructure, Überbau, or endemios puentes in it. Neither of the two words mentioned above abounds in the works of Marx, contrary to what could be inferred from so much literature on the ideological superstructure. It is true that Engels does insist on the term, especially in certain letters from the 1980s. But Marx himself does not mention it except on very few occasions. Let us remember he only talks about his Perstruktur 3 times, and about Überbau, only once. It is very probable that we are wrong in the number, but in any case it is certain that Marx almost never used that expression. Which is a first reason to think that, although illustrative of a scientific theory, the famous superstructure was nothing else, for Marx, than a metaphor, used with stylistic discretion on a few occasions and most of the time replaced by other metaphors or, better yet, by theoretical explanations. The same thing happens with the no less famous reflection, a metaphor arbitrarily turned into a theory and which we will examine later. When Marx handled a theory, he analyzed it and repeated it ad nauseam, as occurs with the labor theory of value or the theory of surplus value. On the other hand, when he used a metaphor, he knew how to be discreet and used it on rare occasions, since he was not unaware that metaphors require, for their use appropriate, the strictest stylistic economy. Let us approach the texts. Marx says in the German Ideology, the form of exchange conditioned by the forces of production existing in all previous historical phases and which, in turn, conditions them is civil society, which has as its premise and foundation the simple family and the composite family, which is usually called the tribe. This already reveals that this civil society is the true home and stage of all history, and how absurd is the previous historical conception that, ignoring real relationships, only looks, with its limitation, to the resounding actions of the bosses and the state. Civil society encompasses all the material exchange of individuals, in a certain phase of development of the productive forces. The term civil society appeared in the 18th century, when property relations had already broken away from the framework of the ancient and medieval community. Civil society, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft as such, only develops with the bourgeoisie, however, the social organization that develops directly on the basis of production and exchange, and that forms in all times the basis of the state and of all other ideal superstructure idea. Listisken Superstrukturell, has always, invariably, been designated by the same name. This fragment is the most exact prefiguration of the historical materialist design executed by Marx in his famous prologue of 1859, which we will examine later. Now, the is the superstructure alluded to in the text an explanation or a metaphor? If it were an explanation, it would have to make explicit the concrete way in which material social relations, the civil society of which Hegel spoke, produce ad hoc ideological formations. Hoc, legal bodies that with convoluted casuistry justify private property as an inalienable right, religious beliefs that are erected as the ultra-terrestrial foundation of earthly misery by proclaiming the wonders of material poverty, phenomena such as the state that does not being but products of a certain material situation, they become producers and maintainers of that situation, and, finally, the famous principles of the philosophers who, being nothing more than products of history, proclaim themselves as the effective motors of it. However, none of this is explained by the mere mention of a superstructure mounted on the base. In other parts of the German ideology, as well as in other works of his, Marx gives us explanations like the ones alluded to above, but precisely then, when he goes on to explain, he abandons the metaphor of the superstructure and dedicates himself to describe in detail the ideological formations and their relations with the social structure. Marx knew what Marxists do not seem to know, that it is one thing to present a theory schematically by resorting to some illustrative metaphors, and quite another to explain that theory scientifically and positively. Man, he was within his perfect rights as a writer when he occasionally used metaphors in the annotated sense, precisely because his work did not remain pure metaphors. The same thing happens with alienation, which began as an ethical metaphor and progressively became a socio-economic explanation. To say that the worker is alienated from himself is, for one thing, a metaphor, but it becomes a scientific explanation when we discover, guided by Marx, that the worker's source of labor, by becoming a commodity, which the social system of production forces him to do, becomes the number one enemy of the world. Own worker. Just as there are those who, tendentiously, try to reduce alienation to its metaphorical characteristics and speak of a ghostly human essence that is separated from the worker, with which they do nothing but arbitrarily reduce the entire theoretical corpus of Marx to certain passages from 1844 never authorized by Marx, in the same way there is a whole legion of alleged Marxists who reduce the theory of ideological formations to the pure metaphor of the ideological superstructure, a metaphor that, isolated from all the theoretical designatum that it does not make but to illustrate, it turns the whole of Marx's theory upside down, it turns on its head everything that Marx strove to achieve. Standing on the ground. Well, suppose for a moment that superstructure is an explanatory term and not merely metaphorical, what would it be that explains us? It cannot explain anything other than the following: society, being a material structure, has mounted on it a superstructure of an ideal character, but if it is mounted on the structure in the same way as a scaffold, it is possible to separate it from the structure, in the same way as a scaffolding is separated, and to consider it independently of it. If ideology is really, and not metaphorically, a superstructure, what prompts us to regard it as a heaven apart, an autonomous scaffolding? With which we end up precisely in the position of the ideologues that Marx so relentlessly attacked. Did not he reproach those who considered ideas, beliefs, religions, philosophical postulates ran a separate kingdom, independent of the civil society, that is, the material life of society? Didn't he call them precisely for this reason ideologues? In other words, taking the superstructure for a scientific explanation is equivalent to converting man into an ideologue, when not into an outrageous Platonic believer in a topos hyper-auranios or super-celestial place where ideas are installed. Let us now look at the famous passage from Marx's prologue to his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, to which all those who, using Garcia Baca's word, we will call dogmatique.ros cling like bears. In the social production of their life, men enter into certain relationships, necessary and independent of their will. They are relations of production, which correspond to a certain degree of development of its material productive forces. The set of these relationships forms the economic structure, okonomische Struktur, of society, the real foundation, die reale basis, on which rises a legal and political building, Überbau, to which certain forms of social consciousness correspond. The alteration of the economic foundations, okonomische Grundlage, is accompanied by a more or less rapid subversive shaking of all that enormous edifice-G as is known. Book I of Capital was translated into French, in the Life of Marx, by J. Roy, whose translation Marx personally revised. Now, in Book I, Marx quotes the fragment of his prologue of 1859 that we transcribed above. The translation that we offer here of this fragment is inspired by the French revised by Marx. On the other hand, it is to be supposed that in the case of such an important text, Marx must have reviewed it with special attention. Well then, their Überbau is not poured by superstructure, but by building, edifice. And basis and Grundlage are translated as Fundament. No one will sensibly deny, then, that these terms possess a greater authority than the famous base and superstructure of which contemporary Marxism speaks so much. But it is not our purpose here to close ourselves in a merely terminological matter. Bad that good. Base and superstructure come to tell us the same thing as the other terms, in the sense that they can fulfill their role as terms of an analogy. But they do it, from the literary point of view, with less propriety, since Manner's idea is to compare the economic structure of society to the foundations or foundations of a building, on the one hand, and on the other, to compare the formation ideological structure of that society, that is, its legal and political facade, the state, to the building itself, which rests on those foundations. An ideologue is someone who, with rough village criteria, thinks that because the foundations are not in sight, they do not exist. That is, he confuses society with its legal political facade, forgetting or denying like an intellectual ostrich the real economic foundation on which all this facade rests. And if he sees the world inverted, upside down, it is because he believes that the building supports the foundations, and not the foundations the building. That is, he judges societies by what they think of themselves, by the ideological clothing they wear. They exhibit, and not because of the real relationships that their individuals maintain. This has a highly concealing and deceptive character if one thinks that these material relations are relations of exploitation. The analogy is, then, as follows: economic structure, Struktur, foundations, basis, ideology, building, Überbau. There is, as can be seen, an equality of relations, which is what, according to Aristotle, constitutes a analogy. But the fact that there is an analogical equality of relations does not in any way imply that the terms of the second set really replace those of the first set. They can only substitute for them metaphorically. Every metaphor consists in this transposition. If we say, old age is to life what sunset is to day, we state an analogy, but if we say, substituting positions, the sunset of life, to refer to old age, we state a metaphor. In the same way, if we say, the base or foundation of society, we issue a metaphor. And the same happens if we say, ideological building or superstructure. The metaphorical nature of the term in question is thus demonstrated. Marx's work is dressed up of many metaphors of this type, whose value is eminently literary, and scientific, if you will, since these metaphors contribute to the clarification of theories. Marx's theory is that the social relations of production dominate and determine the entire ideological aspect of society. That is, the legal political body, the state, and the various social beliefs. His metaphor is, the economic base or foundation sustains the entire enormous superstructure or ideological edifice. Let us do justice to Marx's literary style, let us respect his metaphors as metaphors. And let us do justice to their scientific theories, let us not confuse them with their metaphorical auxiliaries. Much of the determinism and schematicism that theorists bourgeois tend to reproach Marx, they come from these confusions, unfortunately spread by Marxists. Are the Marxists, and not the bourgeois ideologues, who have turned the superstructure into a scientific theory, all they have achieved is, conversely, to transform Marx's theory into an ideology. In the previously analyzed fragment of the prologue of 1859, there is a certain verbal dichotomy discreetly inserted there by Marx, and that serves as a bridge between the metaphor of the superstructure and that of the reflection. We have seen that in the terms of the analogy there are two sets. The first of them, economic structure/ideology, is the scientific expression of the theory. The second, base/building, which corresponds linearly to the first, is the metaphorical expression. This verbal dichotomy of mind becomes even more apparent if we recall the German terms used by Marx. Economic structure is ökonomische Struktur, and for its part, the building or superstructure is not Superstruktur, but Überbau. It is symptomatic that, for the scientific expression, Marx uses the word of Latin origin Struktur or structure, which designates a concrete epistemological concept of enormous theoretical importance in the mature works of Marx, particularly in Capital, as Maurice Godelier has shown in his essay System, Structure, and Contradiction in Capital, where Marx is described as a precursor of contemporary structuralism. And no less symptomatic is the use, in the metaphorical expression, of a non-Germanic term, Überbau, which does not itself represent a scientific concept and whose role is that of an analogical correspondent. If Marx, as occurs at the beginning of Capital, took care to point out this type of verbal dichotomy with the English authors of the X_2, who designated use value with a Germanic term, worth, and with a Romanesque one, value of change, value, why not practice these kinds of observations in Marx's own prose? All of this warns us of the danger of thinking of Marxist theory in terms of superstructure, a term that almost forces us to imagine the world of ideology as something superior, apart, a realm independent of and floating above the social structure. What is true is the reverse. The ideology _I_ey develops in the social structure itself, it is its interior continuation and has, within it, a daily and active role. In accordance with an economic structure dominated by exploitation, ideology has up to now fulfilled the role of justifying this exploitation, and is itself an exploitation, if the idea of ideological surplus value is accepted, which I have proposed in a volume. When Marcuse tells us, today the ideology is in the process of production itself, does nothing but correctly state the Marxist theory of ideology, as something not separate from the social structure, but immanent in it, produced by it and acting within it. When, for example, the state applies the legal ideology of private property to justify the accumulation of wealth in a few hands and its unequal distribution, is it not perhaps an ideology acting in and from the social structure? Ideology is a product of the material situation, in no way implies its constitution in a world placed above the material situation. Ideology remains adhered to the social skeleton or, to use Althusser's metaphor, acts in the manner of a social cement. Now then, just as it has been fortunate to speak of an ideological superstructure, no less fortunate has been, to designate the Marxist theory of ideology, the metaphor of ideological reflex. And the same as in the previous case, Here is a verbal dichotomy expressly used by Marx and which has been completely reversed by his interpreters. They have preferred to stay with the metaphor of ideology as a reflection of the material structure of society, and incidentally have left aside the scientific terms with which Marx expounds the problem, centered around the term Ausdruck or expression, which defines ideology as an expression of material relations. In my previously alluded to book, La Surplus Valia Ideologica, there is a detailed discussion on this point. I will repeat it now, but emphasizing new observations and the literary aspect of the problem, in order to emphasize the importance that a careful reading of Marx's style can acquire not only to define it as style, but to discover its true theoretical content. The metaphor of reflection is expressed in a classic passage from the German ideology: if in all ideology men and their relationships appear upside down, as in a dark room, this phenomenon responds to their historical process of life. Like the inversion of when objects are projected onto the retina, they respond to their directly physical life process. Completely contrary to what happens in German philosophy, which descends from heaven to earth, here one ascends from earth to heaven. That is to say, one does not start from what men say, represent, or imagine, nor from the man preached, thought, presented, or imagined, to arrive, starting from here, to the man of flesh and blood. It starts from the man who really acts and, starting from his real life process, the development of the ideological reflections and echoes, der ideologischen Reflexe und echoes, of this life process is also exposed. Also the nebulous formations, Nebelbildungen, that condense in the brain of men are necessary sublimations of their material life process, process empirically 43 see chapter 2. Registrable and subject to material conditions. Morality, religion, metaphysics, and any other ideology thus lose the appearance of their own substantivity. They do not have their own history or their own development, but the men who develop their material production and their material exchange also change. As this reality changes, their thought, and the products of their thought. From the German ideology, Marx almost completely abandons his metaphor of reflection, which does not appear in his work except on very few occasions. The same does not happen with Engels, co-author of the German ideology, as the author of the Anti-Die insisted many times, especially in texts from his old age, in the metaphor in question, giving it all the qualities of religious reflection, legal reflection, aesthetic reflection, etc., and without worrying too much about clearly separating what was a metaphor from what was which was theory. His error did not lie in his use of that metaphor, for there is nothing wrong with an adequate and pertinent metaphor, but in his failure to publish the German ideology, a work that would have answered by itself the many misrepresentations that already in Engels' life suffered from the Marx-Engelsian theory of ideology, which we will discuss later. Let us now analyze the text transcribed above. In the same way as in the case of the superstructure, we are here faced with -1 an analogy in the strict sense of the term. Better said, we find ourselves with two linked and complementary analogies. The first one, which serves as the basis for the other, is outlined in this way: ideology reflection human mind camera obscura, that is, ideology appears in the human mind in a similar way to how the optical reflection appears in the camera obscura. Just as in the camera obscura an inverted reflection of physical reality appears, in the same way ideology appears in the human mind as an inverted representation of the world, that is, a world view in which ideas drive the world to men, and not men to ideas. Such is the analogy. The metaphor appears with the substitution of terms, that is, when one speaks of ideological reflection. It is not the only metaphor that could appear with this procedure. Indeed, one can also speak of a photographic mind, of mental reflection, and, why not, of ideological photography. They are all metaphors as legitimate as that of ideological reflection. On the other hand, it is a typical metaphor of the time in which photography was invented. Also, when electricity was invented, all the poets spoke of their beloved electrifying thing, which still survives in the different icliomas as a residual metaphor that has lost its primitive brilliance and has become 40. Leonardo da Vinci had already devised the camera obscura. The first photograph is from 1826, and a later refinement, from 1838. Marx writes the German ideology in 1845-46. Mado in commonplace. The metaphor of reflection has also become commonplace today, that is, it has undergone a process of reification or hardening. The second analogy follows from the first and provides more specific material for analysis. His scheme is this: ideology, typical reflection, physical natural reality, and historical natural reality. That is, the ideology of societies keeps with respect to their history and their material life process a similar relationship to the one that keeps the image that is produced in the retina with respect to immediate physical reality. The inversion of objects, Marx tells us, when projected on the retina responds to his directly physical life process. In the same way, the inverted representation of the world, that is, the ideological belief that it is ideas that produce history, and not history to ideas, that occurs in ideology responds to the historical and material life process of societies and their men. In the first case, physical reality determines the reflection; in the second, the historical reality determines the ideology. So far the analogy. Again, the metaphor appears with the substitution of terms, saying ideological reflection, as Marx tells us, is practicing a metaphor. We must firmly distinguish metaphorical expressions from theoretical explanatory expressions. But first, the reader should meditate on the following. Marx speaks to us of ideal reflections and echoes. There is, then, more than one metaphor. Alongside the plastic metaphor, he gives us an acoustic metaphor. Ideology is like an echo of real social life. This acoustic metaphor is not minutely developed like the other, however. The ideological echo has as much metaphorical power and legitimacy within the text as the ideological reflection. If Marx and Engels had emphasized echo more than reflection, there is no doubt that what today passes for reflection theory in many Marxist works would be an echo theory. Morality, metaphysics, religion, legal forms, would be catalogued as the ideological echoes of society. The Marxist histories of philosophy would not tell us, as they do ad nauseum today, that Plato's philosophy was the ideological reflection of an aristocratic and slave-owning society. They would tell us that such a philosophy was an ideological echo of that society. All of which would have nothing serious if these expressions were used as metaphors. At most, one would have to ask for greater literary originality, instead of the religious repetition of Marx's metaphors. But what is serious, what is disastrous for contemporary Marxism is that such metaphors are offered as scientific theories, as thorough explanations of historical materialism. For example, the number of theoretical coarsenesses that exist in treatises and manuals about the aesthetic reflection is impressive. And it is not just about the inevitable manuals, also the most authoritative and profound connoisseurs of Marx make this mistake. Mentioning two names at random, let us remember that the conspicuous English Marxist George Thomson, in his work The First Philosophers, tells us of a certain phrase of Heraclitus: all things are changed into fire and fire is changed in all things, like gold for merchandise and merchandise for gold, that this is nothing more than the ideological reflection of an economy based on the production of merchandise. And Lukács, in the prologue to his Prolegomena to a Marxist Aesthetics, tells us that at the base of this book is the general idea that the scientific reflection and the aesthetic reflection reflect the same objective reality. If you want to make a Marxist science of ideology, why keep resorting to Marx's metaphors and not to his scientific explanations? Let's repeat it: the problem is not the metaphors themselves, but in their relation to the theory of a phrase by Heraclitus that it is the ideological reflection of the production of merchandise. That is to say something metaphorically correct, but it is in no way equivalent to scientifically explaining the process of historical and social genesis of a thought that takes as its general equivalent precisely to gold and pits it against all other merchandise. it would be necessary to explain how the evolution of the monetary system is expressed in the phrase of Heraclitus, and this is not explained by saying that this phrase is the ideological reflection logical of commodity production. The same is true in the words of Lukács, neither science nor art really reflect anything, would not be better to say, instead, that science and art express a reality that is the same, and each one does so with an active language, and not as passive reflexes. If we strictly follow the reflection metaphor, we would have to conclude that science and art photograph reality. Would Lukács be willing to accept this as a scientific explanation of Marxist epistemology? But all this becomes even clearer if we return to the analysis of the analogy proposed in the German ideology. The relationship between ideology and historical reality is a dependency relationship, comparable to the dependency relationship between optical reflection and physical natural reality. There are two possibilities regarding this comparison. 1. Consider it as an analogy, a source of metaphors such as the ideological reflex. 2. Consider it as a scientific explanation. If we consider it as an analogy, it is accepted that it does not constitute a complete scientific explanation, but rather the literary illustration of a theory. This can only be demonstrated if we first demonstrate that the expressions in question do not constitute a scientific explanation. Indeed, if we consider it as a scientific explanation, where does it lead us? Let us advance the conclusion. It leads us to present Marx's theory as it is presented by bourgeois ideologues, namely, as an absurd mechanistic determinism, if not as a unilateral causalism. Let us illustrate the explanation by means of a diagram. Historical reality. Optic reflex, b. Physical natural reality. It is about knowing if, indeed, and not only in a metaphorical world, the relationship between the terms of the set, A, is the same as that between the terms of the set, B. The arrows try to indicate that, effectively and really, this relationship is not the same. What is the relationship between the terms of the set, B? The relationship between the physical natural reality and the optical reflection is a causal relationship. Physical reality causally determines, or, less appropriately, produces, the optical reflection. A determination is causal when, as Bungay explains it to us, it is carried out unequivocally or unequivocally by external conditions. In the case of the optical reflection, it is also an irreversible determination that goes from reality to reality. Now, is this the same type of determination that exists between historical reality and ideology, according to Marxist theory? In any way. Historical reality does not causally determine ideological formations. In the first place, because history can determine individuals externally, but also internally, from within the individuals themselves, as disciplines such as the sociology of knowledge or, more appropriately, psychoanalysis affirm today, when it locates determinations social in the unconsciousness and preconsciousness of the individual, of terminations that are nothing other than ideology. Secondly, because the determination is here reversible and multivocal, indeed, if it is the historical and social reality, the material process of life, which gives its character to the ideology of a society, it is no less certain that, once this character, T, is constituted, it affects the social reality, acts on it, JF, and, in short, determines it ideologically. A vicious circle should not be seen in this reversibility. Empirically, it is necessary to examine the material conditions of society in order to understand the true character which it is, and a posteriori character of the ideology of that society. There would be a vicious circle if the opposite were true, that the material character of a society can be ascertained from a mere examination of its ideology, which is not true, precisely because all ideology is the justification of a pre-existing material order and interests. Historically speaking, only with the full development of capitalism in the 20th century has a full capitalist ideology been able to be constituted, an ideology that justifies to the entire system in each one of its parts. This has been possible due to the advancement of the mass media. Finally, historical reality multivocally determines ideology, and ideology, in turn, multivocally overdetermines historical reality. Indeed, it is the multiple facets of the material apparatus of a society, the private property regime, the mercantile and monetary economy, the social division of labor, the class struggle, that determine the general character of its ideology. On the other hand, this ideology has a multivocal impact on the material apparatus, responding to its determinations through legal bodies, social institutions such as free enterprise, Christian morality that authorizes and recommends material misery, a certain kind of social science divided into compartments that theoretically reproduce the material division of labor, etc. If private property is, in the material order, an alienation, the legal ideology will be in charge of demonstrating that private property is an inalienable right. If an underdeveloped country is economically dependent on an imperialist power, both the imperialist power and the underdeveloped country will take it upon themselves to spread the ideology of nationalism and self-determination. It is a veritable game in which material reality produces an ideology that denies the true character of material reality by idealizing it, and then, in turn, actively influences that reality, so that it is doubly denied, that is, affirmed. That is why the essential of all ideology is the deep and constant affirmation of the existing material order, its supreme justification. As can be seen, the inadequacy of the two sets of terms that formed the initially presented analogy is demonstrated, that is, it demonstrates its scientific inadequacy, but not its metaphorical inadequacy. The most curious thing about all this is that if Marx had remained in the metaphorical formulation of his thesis, there would be some reason, at least formal, for the confusion previously discussed in which so many Marxists have incurred. But what is certain, what is objectively verifiable, is that Marx used that metaphor very few times, and instead on countless occasions he speaks to us of the theory of ideology as an expression, Ausdruck, of material relations. Which does constitute a clue for a scientific analysis, since to say that ideology is expression is equivalent to determining it as language, that is, as action and not as passion, as an active element and not as a mere passive reflection. The current media, which constitute the core of capitalist ideology, are they a passive reflection of society, or are they, on the contrary, an incessant language that imposes itself on us daily and penetrates even those anemic interstices of what was Freud talking about? What is jurisprudence if not convoluted language to justify the existing social order? What is religion, if not a subtle handling of ethical symbols? What is speculative philosophy if not a language that today has been dissected, analyzed, and criticized by scientific philosophy? Ideology is the expression of society, it is its language. Language and consciousness, Marx said, are social products, Gesellschaftliche Produkt. And his theory of ideology is scientifically formulated when, instead of speaking of reflection, he tells us, for example, the dominant ideas are nothing other than the expression, Ausdruck, of the dominant material relations, the same dominant material relations conceived as ideas. Degree From all this can be deduced the need in which contemporary Marxism finds itself to revise its readings of the work of Marx. See this work from the stylistic point of view. For the careful examination of a style is the primary means of separating everything in that style that is metaphor, literary game, illustration, or ornament, from everything that is properly theory. All the more important is such a study of the work of Marx. Marx belongs to a genre of scientific writers of which very few samples are found today. His determination to overcome in himself all division of labor led him to cover all aspects of scientific endeavor, including first and foremost the literary aspect. Why insist on denying Marx what was always a concern for him, his literary style? In communist society, Marx tells us, man appropriates his omnilateral being in an omnilateral way and, therefore, as a total man. Division of labor. Man today is, as Marcuse has described him, one-dimensional, one-sided. It is common practice for scientific researchers at American universities to make a first draft of their writings and then hand them over to a stylist. What for? He writes them neatly. Such a division of labor would have been rejected with horror by Marx. But if he was an omnidimensional, omnilateral scientist, who cared as much about the precision of his calculations as the precision of his metaphors, why distort and split him? Why take his metaphors for what they are not? It is a similar, but inverse, error to that made by one-dimensional bourgeois scientists when, irritated by Marx's metaphors, they assert that all of Marx's work is a metaphor, and that the theory of surplus value is the product of a feverish imagination. Messianic. We have seen that the superstructure and the reflection are, strictly speaking, metaphors, and as such they were used by Marx, who possessed from a very young age an impressive mastery of both metaphorical technique and art. The two terms mentioned are literary illustrations of a scientific theory, the theory of ideology, closely linked to Marx's general theory of materialism. That many commentators of yesterday and today speak of an alleged reflection theory and of a superstructure theory is nothing but a sign of mental laziness, for, of course, it is much easier and more convenient to evade explanations scientific and stay with their metaphorical substitutes. It is one of the reasons for the famous manual schematics. The metaphor of religion, to which Marx returned again and again in his writings throughout the ages, has fared somewhat better than those previously studied. It has not been the victim of too many mystifications, and perhaps this has happened precisely because it is a metaphor specifically designed to destroy the mystification par excellence, religion. As a general definition of this metaphor, it can be said that its specific mission in the work of Marx was to provide an analogy that illuminates, through the comparison with religious alienation, the phenomenon of alienation from work, and in general the phenomenon of alienation. Social and historical phenomenon of alienation. Thus we find it in the manuscripts of 1844, and thus it remains in major writings such as the Grundriss, Capital, or the theories of surplus value. We have seen that he said in 1844, just as in religion the activity of the human fantasy, of the human mind and heart acts on the individual independently of him, as a strange, divine, or diabolical activity, in the same way the activity of the worker is not his own activity. It belongs to another, it is the loss of itself. Between the productive activity of the worker and the worker himself. It is the relationship of alienation. The first form of alienation was, in the manuscripts of 1944, no longer the productive activity itself, but the alienation of the product of the worked. In Capital we are told, in a phrase quoted 1,000 times, that just as in religion the products of the human mind turn against man, in the same way in the regime of commodity production the products of the human mind turn against man. Products of his own arm. And in the no less famous chapter on mercantile fetishism, Marx expressly presents his metaphor as an analogy, the commodity form and the value relation of the work products in which this form takes shape has absolutely nothing to do with its physical character or with the material relations that derive from this character. What here takes on, in the eyes of men, the phantasmagorical form of a relationship between material objects is nothing more than a concrete social relationship established between men themselves. Therefore, if we want to find an analogy, une analogie, to this phenomenon, we have to go back to the nebulous regions of religion, where the products of the human mind resemble beings endowed with their own life, of independent existence, and related to each other. Yes, and with men. This is what happens in the world of merchandise with the products of the hand of man. This is what I call fetishism, too. It is not the same to say alienation as fetish gossip, because although all mercantile fetishism implies alienation, not all alienation implies mercantile fetishism. However, here it is about what in 1844 Marx called alienation of product. Is it not significant that, to describe Verla, use exactly the same analogy in 1844 and in 1867? The analogy now runs like this: the relationship between the religious products of the mind and the mind itself is the same as the relationship between the commodity products of man and man himself. The equality of relations in which the analogy consists is none other than the fetishism existing in both sets of cases. It is as if we were to say, 4:2, 16:3. The arithmetical relation is the same. Religious alienation serves as a perfect metaphor for the alienation of work. Another way of using the religious metaphor is to establish, as Marx does in the manuscripts of 1944 and in the Grundrisse, a curious comparison between Christ and money. In the reading notes of 1844, money is defined as an alienated mediator, by which is meant that what is alienated is the mediating activity itself, a prefiguration of commercial fetishism, in which the form of money appears as the supreme alienation. It is not just a social relationship, it seems to become a material thing endowed with mediating powers in the relationships between men, so that these are reified while money is personalized. From that mediator, he gets richer. This formula is repeated in Capital and in the theories of surplus value as Personifiziering der Sache und die Versacklichung der Person, that is, personification of the thing and reification of the person. Now then, Christ primitively represents, 1. Men before God, 2. God for men, 3. Men for man. Thus, by definition, money represents primitively, 1. Private property for private property, 2. Society for private property, 3. Private property for society. But Christ is God alienated and man alienated. God's only value comes from representing Christ, man's only value it comes from the fact that it represents Christ. The same thing happens with money. From which it follows, pursuing the analogy, that the only value of man in this society comes from the fact that it represents money. Marx measured the value of commodities by the labor time socially necessary to produce them. What would you say about the contemporary phrase time is money? The comparison with Christ is all the stronger since Christ has always been represented as the spirit of material poverty, but it is even more curious if we remember that an ancient tradition, expressed in St. Augustine, gave Christ the name of mediator or mediator. St. Augustine writes in his treatise on the Gospel of St. John that Christ was homo manifestus, deus occultus, and therefore, unus enim deus, et unus mediator dei et hominum homo Christus Isis. The dual nature of Christ, who is man on the outside and God on the inside, inspires the metaphor of money, which is use value on the outside, and exchange value on the inside. And just as in Christ the man is alienated in Almighty God, in the same way in money man alienates himself in an omnipotent thing. In the Grundrisse the same Christ-money metaphor appears, expressed with even greater propriety as far as economic analysis is concerned. After discussing the importance of the notion of capital in the modern economy, he writes the following: it is important to note that wealth as such, that is, bourgeois wealth, finds its most dynamic expression in exchange value. Posited as a mediator and as a link between himself and use value, when they have reached their extreme point, since this point unites opposites and in the last analysis resembles a superior and unilateral power compared to the extremes it contains, it appears as the completed economic relationship. In effect, the movement or relationship that originally plays the role of intermediary between the extremes leads necessarily and dialectically to the following result: it appears as its own mediation, as the subject whose moments are the extremes, to which he suppresses the character of independent presuppositions in order to pose himself, through such overcoming, as the only autonomous factor. Thus, in the religious sphere, Christ mediator between God and the man and simple instrument of circulation between one and the other becomes the unity of those, man-God, and as such takes on more importance than God. The saints are more important than and sto. Priests are more important and 55 tes than saints. In this fragment, the metaphor is further stylized and refined, a process that only reflects the refinement of Marx's economic analysis, still insufficient in the manuscripts of 44. The metaphor the initial Christ money is now subtilized in the metaphor Christ exchange value. Both have a double value. Christ is not only God, but man, and the exchange value is himself, plus a use value that sustains and incarnates him, in the same way that God is incarnated in man. And just as in the God-man unity, the first member or God becomes mediation between God and man, that is, mediation of himself, in the same way in the unit use value exchange value, the latter stands strangely as a mediator between use and change, that is, as a mediator of itself. Thus, Christ, as a mediator, becomes something more important than God, who, after all, lives in celestial solitude, and likewise, exchange value, as a mediator, becomes more important than use value. Here is a metaphor of an economy based on exchange value, in which the market acquires more importance than man, and it is produced to cover the needs of the market and not those of man, just as in religion more are covered the administrative needs of the church than the needs of God. And just as the economy has been based on the competition of all against all and not on distribution according to need, in the same way religion has been based on the fear of hell and not on the love of heaven. Also in the theories on surplus value or Book 4 of Capital, which were written in between 1861 and 1863, as well as in other manuscripts from 1863 to 65, the religious metaphor appears, or religion as a metaphor. Its mode of appearance is similar to the mode we have already seen in the manuscripts of 1844 and in Capital, regarding the alienation of the product, its domination over the producer. Contrary to what authors such as Althusser or Bottigelli think, for whom alienation disappears from the mature Marx, these manuscripts of Marx stand incontestable, in which the word Entfremdung appears many times and, more than that, the theory itself of perfectly matured and a Hegelianized alienation. In a partially preserved manuscript of 1863 to 65, Marx writes, "The capitalist fulfills his function only as personified capital, he is capital made person. Similarly, the worker is nothing but labor personified, labor that is his as his pain and toil, but which belongs to the capitalist as an incessant wealth-creating substance. In this form, labor appears in fact as an element incorporated into capital in the production process, as its living, variable factor. The domination of the capitalist over the worker is, therefore, the domination of the object over man, of dead labor over living labor, of the product over the producer, since merchandise, which becomes the means to dominate the worker, but only as means of domination of capital itself, are nothing but the results and products of the productive process. In material production, the true process of social life, which is nothing other than the production process, we have exactly the same relationship that occurs, within the ideological domain, in religion, the subject transformed into an object, and the object transformed into a subject. Such is the process of alienation of man's own labor. Here, from the beginning, the worker surpasses the capitalist, the latter is rooted in this process of alienation and finds his absolute contentment in it, while the worker is from the beginning in a state of rebellion against it and experiences it as an act of servitude. This is not the place to underline all the theoretical consequences of such an important passage regarding alienation in Marx. Suffice it to say that it is a much more explicit text than all the others of 1844, and also integrated into an already perfected socio-economic analysis, which has non-existent categories in the manuscripts, surplus value, the notion of labor fuel, etc. However, as in 1844, here appears the religious metaphor, which constitutes a true stylistic constant in Marx's work to describe the problem of alienation. Since his Feuerbachian juvenile days, man had learned that religious alienation consists, put simply, in the conversion of the subject into an object, of the true creator, man, into the created entity or creature, from which arises the domination of creation over the creator and, therefore, Espirit Conc 1 Uaro, Poerlko, Mockery 91. Therefore, the dominance of the object over the subject. This will always serve as a great metaphor to describe what happens in economic alienation, in which man's products, merchandise, become the dominating agents of social life, the true social beings, as that men get stiff, they become helpless, passive, submissive things. It is the domain of materialized, objectified, dead labor over living labor. As he writes in a prologue to Book I of Capital, not only the living torment us, but also the dead. Le mort sit levif. So far I have presented the three features that underpin Marx's style and define it as architectural style, dialectical style, and style of great metaphors such as religion. Before the final balance, I will briefly note other features that, without being minor, do not need a detailed explanation. These are the three traits that I will call the concrete spirit, polemical spirit, and mocking spirit. What I call the concrete spirit of Marx's literary and intellectual style is nothing other than the coexistence, in his work, of a remarkable capacity for abstraction combined and dominated by a no less remarkable capacity for concretion. Althusser was right when, in an article in his Poor Marx, he characterized Marx's personal style of experience as a sensitization to the concrete, so extraordinary in him that it lent each of his encounters with reality a great force of conviction and revelation. Indeed, Marx's true object of study was the historical concrete, the concrete totality of which he speaks in that general introduction to his Economics, written with the Grundriss and later replaced by the preface to the Contribution to Critique of Political Economy. Precisely in that text he writes his famous methodological principle: the concrete is concrete because it is the synthesis of diverse determinations _v, therefore, unity in diversity. *degree. But right there he explains that the concrete always appears in thought as a result, and this result is achieved through abstraction. It is the path that he will follow in Book I of Capital, which goes from the abstract to the concrete, from merchandise in its most general form to its concrete form of money, from fetishism in its most abstract form to the concrete process of production of surplus value, where that fetishism is realized in the hidden workshop of production. This methodological principle, which brings together in the notion of totality a whole deductive-inductive movement, which goes from the abstract to the concrete and from the concrete to the abstract, also functions as a stylistic principle, Marx's style, particularly in this artistic whole. That it is Book I of Capital, it is configured as a constant intellectual movement that goes from the abstract to the concrete and vice versa, which clearly shines through in the vocabulary. Thus, for example, in the first chapters, which constitute a moment of maximum abstraction of economic categories and analysis purely without chronicle, the predominant word is form. The merchandise form, unfolded in the forms of value, exchange value, and use value, the form of exchange value, supported by the equivalential form, etc. The commodity is the elementary form, or economic cell. The work achieves that the matter changes form. In the canvas and the coat, value only appears when their specific qualities are abstracted from them, to reduce them to the same quality, that of human work. The latter will acquire the form of abstract human work. The fetishism of commodities makes them appear given their double form as physically metaphysical beings. Etc. Degree. But once this abstract threshold has been crossed, which earned Marx the adjective metaphysical during his lifetime. Marx's style is adapted to the new methodological phase, which must now deal with concrete phenomena, such as the manufacturing division of labor and machinery and big industry. Thus, when speaking of the division of labor, Marx's style penetrates to the last interstices of this phenomenon, through examples and, sometimes, curious metaphors, such as that according to which a certain businessman 0 degrees. All these expressions are found in Karl Marx, who intended to make a worker do a different job with each hand, failed in his attempt, and will always fail until two-headed men are found. And when talking about machinery, he begins with the very definition of machine, abstract moment, and then, through the analysis of the simplest machines, the first of all, the water mill, he arrives at the most complete description of modern machinery. This descriptive process, which would be an opportune occasion to fall into scholarly ponderousness and verbal boredom, nevertheless gives Marx the opportunity to deceive brilliant comparisons in his descriptions and, of course, what is more important, to slip continuously and theory through the empirical descriptions. Despite his enormous capacity for abstraction, Marx never fell into speculative ease. He did not invent capitalism thinking, but studying specific and concrete phenomena. This effort translated wonderfully into his style, which is the style of a writer with great ability to fly but who never loses sight of solid ground, which is appropriate for a science writer. Every deep philosophical problem, he wrote in the German ideology, reduces to an empirical fact pure and simple. Degree 1. The other two traits, which we designate as polemical spirit and mocking spirit, actually form a single characteristic, a single facet. The distinction is due only to nuances that this facet acquires. As Maximilian Rubel has pointed out in his Karl Marx, Essay de Biographie Intellectuelle, the moral spring that impelled Marx to study economics was the indignant verification of the misery of the worker, ethical and political indignation that gave his first works the frank tone of denunciation, a tone that will never go extinct in his style, even on those occasions when he is more coldly scientific. For this reason it has been said that the scientific work of Marx is nothing but a redemptive and messianic ideology, but those who say this are unaware, on the one hand, that Marx was precisely the greatest challenger of ideology, in the name of theory, science, and class consciousness, and on the other they confuse the need for science with a presumed neutrality. Value or ethics, Max Weber, Karl Mannheim. They think that science should be concerned only with enunciating, while denouncing should be left to politicians, with which, after all, they are only doing a new and subtle apology for the division of labor, and reveal the surprise and irritation produced by a social scientist like Marx, in whose work that division of labor did not exist, but was a harmonious whole where the objective statements and the denunciations, no less objective, but pierced by ethical muscles, invariably formed an indivisible bond. From this indignation was born in Marx the polemical spirit, the critical mood that always characterized him as a writer. Few scientists meet in which the scientific spirit and the critical polemical spirit are combined with such intimacy. Marx made philosophical, political, economic criticism, sociological and even literary criticism, if we don't forget his criticism, in La Sagrada Familia, of a novel by Eugenio Sue, The Mysteries of Paris, and numerous scattered observations. His political criticism was so acid and corrosive that it led him to dance from one place to another in Europe, expelled by various governments. His philosophical criticism is fundamentally revealed in the German ideology, where he exposed the ideological and mystifying character that philosophy had had until then, and goes so far as to decree the future extinction of philosophy and cruelly stigmatize the philosophers. Philosophers, when saying that between philosophy and the study of the real world there is the same relationship as between masturbation and sexual love. His socio-economic critique, finally, encompasses the entire body of his work from 1844 onwards, and is impressively vast. He left practically none of the important social scientists of modern times untouched. An exceptional witness to this formidable critical apparatus is his Theories of Surplus Value, an enormous manuscript of thousands of pages. Today it fills 3 thick volumes of the Dietz edition, where he critically reviews all of classical and vulgar economics. A history of philosophy, for example, that would fulfill the critical conditions of this history of political economy, would have to turn inside out the very harmonious history of philosophy that has been institutionalized since Hegel. Within all this critical work, in its very practice, some of Marx's most personal stylistic traits were gestated. His controversial capacity is proverbial, accompanied by a style that made his attacks even harder. If there were no other work, his poverty of philosophy or anti-Proudhon, which constitutes an excellent literary model of polemical literature, would suffice to fully demonstrate it. Never has a critical dismemberment been seen as savage and fierce as the one practiced by Marx in Proudhon. It was all the harder since they had been friends in Paris not too long ago. Criticism is so harsh that sometimes it is exaggerated. On the other hand, the same stylistic virtuosity of Marx, who took numerous quotations from Proudhon's Philosophie de la Mesure and analyzed them down to the last detail, highlighting the hidden messages, the spirit of the letter, the ideology behind the supposed theory, the belief underlying the science, the metaphysical assumption behind the theoretical assumption. The initial apostille is singular, for example. M. Proudhon le mal dit être singulièrement méconnu en Europe. In France, il droit dei mauvais économiste, parce qu'il passe pour être bonne philosophie allemande. In Allemagne, il droit l'autre mauvais philosophe, parce qu'il passe pour être économiste français de plus forts. Nous, en notre qualité allemande et d'économiste à la fois, nous avons voulu protester. Contre cette double ci1 il y a magnificent example, by the way, of the dialectical stylistic trait that we pointed out pages back. To decipher the mysteries of Proudhon, says Marx, one has to learn English and talk about economics, and then discover that one has to learn German and talk about the metaphysics of economics. Thus, because if the Englishman transforms men into hats, the German transforms hats into ideas. Degree 5 Proudhon is a quasi-Hegel, and Marx deems it opportune to give him lessons in Hegelianism, but mock lessons. The exposition, between humorous and transcendental, that Marx makes of the Hegelian dialectic is remarkable. Le oui devenant non, le non devenant oui, le oui devenant à la lois oui et non, le non devenant à la fois non et oui, les contraires se balancent, se neutralisent, se paralysent, j'applique cette méthode auxiliary catégories de one économie politique, et vous la logique et la métaphysique de l'économie politique, ou, en d'autres termes, vous les catégories économiques connues de tout le monde, traduites dans un langage plus connu, qui leur donne one air d'être fraîchement écloses dans un tête raison pure. Degree as can be seen, he passes from the critical style to the polemical style, and from this to the mocking style. Here is the stylistic range of this aspect of Marx. As well as Proudhon, Marx stigmatized with apostasy. Looselays in all his work to numerous authors. It is curious to note that perhaps as a reminder of his Proudhonian experience he often writes the stigmas he throws at him in French, as when he characterizes Destutt de Tracy in Book 2 of Capital by saying that he represents le crétinisme bourgeois. Dans tout sa beatitude. Degree particular viciousness was deserved on more than one occasion by the famous petulant and grumpy epigones academics from German universities. He also severely attacked, as if dealing with people, numerous intellectual fetishes. Of one of these, culture, he says, for example, the contrast between wealth that does not work and poverty that works for a living also causes a contrast in culture. Culture and work, they get divorced. Culture is opposed to work as capital or a luxury item. Table becomes a physically metaphysical object. Not only does it sit up on its legs on the ground, but it stands upside down in front of all the other merchandise, and from its wooden head cravings begin to emerge much more bizarre and strange than if the table suddenly broke apart. Dance of its own accord. Degree every reader of Marx will remember without much effort the hundreds of occasions when he demonstrated a marked verbal virtuosity in the attack, in the polemic, in the merciless mockery of both objectified characters and personified things. He didn't even forgive himself. He not only criticized his own mistakes, but even ironized his own existence, his misfortunes. In this respect, his correspondence with Engels is vivid testimony. With a certain humorous melancholy, he told him, at the time Capital was being written, that never before had so much been written about money. With less money on me. And in another letter, regarding the plague of boils that would not let him finish his damn book, he wrote to his partner, I am confident, of course, that the bourgeoisie will remember my boils as long as I live. 2. Stylistic balance of the work. From Marx. Expression of an architectural idea of society, verbal reflection of a dialectical thought, finished design of vast metaphorical analogies, virtuous writing full of a concrete spirit, a critical polemical spirit and a mocking spirit, such are the most salient features of the style of a writer like Marx, whose origins include poetic meditation and the conception of prose as a work of art, and in whose apex constitutes a scientific corpus literary endowed with a prodigious expressive force. Mastery of prose occurred in Marx in the way that mastery of verse occurs in great poets, suddenly and very early, almost like the manifestation of a linguistic instinct. It is clear that literary and philological studies always help to manifest this vocational instinct, but no, these are more than a firm impulse to start something pre-existing. If Marx progressed and matured over the years in terms of developing an economic and historical conception of society, in terms of literary style he was the owner of a clearly defined personal expression from a very early age. In this sense, it can be taken as a point. Starting in the last months of 1843, Marx was 25 years old when he wrote his introduction to Hegel's philosophy of law, a work of which only that introduction remained. It is true that even earlier Marx had written essays and articles in which it is not difficult to observe numerous stylistic flaws, for example, in his vibrant articles against press censorship. However, it can be ensured that the aforementioned critique constitutes the first document in which we find a style of Marx already personal and finished. It is not by chance that it is a fragment that ended up as an artistic whole, as we have seen that he did when his materials went to print. In terms of round phrases, this essay is a nursery, quite exploited by the way. Some of Marx's phrases that have circulated come from him, such as that of "to be radical is to attack things at the root, but the root, for man, is man himself." And others less famous, but perhaps more significant: "the theory is realized in the people only to the extent that it is the realization of their needs." Equally notable is his Feuerbachian critique of irreligion: "Man makes religion, not religion man," and the materialist tenet that man is man's world, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world, because they themselves are an inverted world. Faced with stuffy German society, those petrified relationships must be forced to dance to their own tune. What is the creation of class consciousness if not teaching the people to assume? Doubtless, even without possessing his future scientific wisdom, Marx was master of his expressive wisdom, as this masterful piece of critical prose demonstrates. The /Manuscritos of 1944 lack this perfection, even though, as we have seen with examples, they are full of stylistically brilliant fragments. At times they deserve the name of Lyrioliten darkness given to them by Peter D. Metz, formulations mostly of a philosophical nature, full of an abstract vocabulary, human essence, etc., of which he himself would mock 5 years later in a passage of the Mani Communist Party. It is precisely this philosophical obscurity that has been the door through which certain metaphysical Marxologists and even Christian Marxologists have entered to speculate about these manuscripts in our century, not being able, of course, to sneak in the same way into the scientific transparency of mature works of Marx. It is a pity that these manuscripts did not receive the literary polishing of their author, and that, on the contrary, they began the vast career of his unfinished works. A milestone to a certain intermediate point in this regard is constituted by the German ideology, 1845-18 Loi, but if it is intermediate, it was precisely. For, even when he did not make it to the press, he made more way to it than other posthumous manuscripts. He nearly received the last polish. The first part, on Feuerbach, is nevertheless a stylistically finished set, full of masterful ironies towards bourgeois philosophers and economists. Thus, he tells us, regarding philosophical hedonism, that the philosophy of enjoyment has never been more than the ingenious language used by certain social circles that enjoy the privilege of enjoying. 2. He also refers to the obligation to philosophize imposed by the division of labor, practiced with surgical zeal in German universities. A typical example of the stylistic trait noted above, see 2.2 above, is the following argument against Feuerbach, he is materialist, history does not appear in him, and insofar as he takes history into account, he is not materialist. Materialism and history appear completely divorced in him. Study of economics, it is like watching the parachute descent of a swarm of philosophical categories towards the firm and crass social reality. The same can be said of the Holy Family, where he attacks in depth all speculative terminology, according to the which concrete is. He calls abstract and the abstract, concrete. In this regard, against the substantialist tendencies that did not stop minds in that of inventing categories and entities, he writes: how could absolute subjectivity, actus purus, pure criticism not see in love its bete noire, Satan personified, in love, which is truly the first thing that teaches man to believe in the world objective outside of it, which not only objectifies man but also humanizes the object. Love cannot be constructed a priori, because love is a real development that occurs in the world of the senses and between individuals real. I agree in this work of Marx, a general trait of his is particularly noticeable, which could be defined as the ironic smile of someone who has the pleasure of fighting philosophers with their own weapons and beyond them, from within and from outside, from a language that is mastered and that at the same time is surpassed. Marx's language in this work is of great virtuosity, although it is a bit exaggerated to say, like Mering, that it is one of his most marvelous pages. Misery of Philosophy is perhaps the last text in which criticism abounds. Philosophy and its corresponding stylistic modules. But we have already talked enough about this work of 1847 in this essay. The Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848, and Wage Work and Capital, 1849, represent the already total integration of socio-economic analysis. The manifesto is an exemplary case of adaptation of the literary style to a certain effect. That it seeks to achieve in the public, the apocalyptic presentation of the facts, the description of history as a dramatically configured theater of class struggles, the terrible predictions and, in general, the poetic aspect, lend this writing an air of breakwater of the eternities, which was precisely what Marx and Engels were looking for, with good political sense. The Wage, Labor and Capital lectures are a first model of economic analysis that belongs almost entirely to the Marx of his maturity, as is shown by the references that he himself makes to this work in Capital. His description of the wage earner is impeccable, and in it the scheme of correlations that reign in a synthesis is repeated. Here is a worker who, for 12 hours a day, weaves, spins, drills, turns, builds, he digs, breaks stones, loads. These 12 hours of weaving, spinning, drilling, turning, building, digging, breaking stones, carrying, are they an expression of his existence for him? Does he see them as the essentials of his life? On the contrary, life begins for him when all this activity ends, at the table, in the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours of work do not mean for him weaving, spinning, turning, but rather earning something to go with to the table, to the tavern, to bed. If the silkworm spun to eke out its existence as a caterpillar, it would be the perfect hireling, Wender Sidum Verm Spacey, WNSE/Tim Xs ALS Rop Z-F Frigerts, so we ir ein vol 1_3 I dot. Igralof 1 I dot ir baf dot. It is clearly noticeable in the style of SC. Fragment the loving stylistic care of the one who offers it as something finished, and the transparency of the one who has abandoned certain arduous philosophemes to explain the problem of the alienation represented in the salary and the derivation of the worker. Between 1850 and 1852 Marx wrote The Class Struggle in France and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, two models of political history that aroused hatred and only increased the misery of the Marx family. For 8 days I have been feeding the family on bread and potatoes, and I wonder if I can afford them today, he wrote to Engels on September 1852. The incisive, implacable style of a writer who was not even intimidated by his poverty had its effect. From then until the time of the GRTMD Riss, Marx was a victim of journalism. Hundreds of articles that add little to his scientific production, if isolated cases are accepted, such as the magnificent article on British domination in India, where he asserts that by destroying the economic base of the Hindu communities, England complies, as an unconscious instrument of history, a revolutionary social role, misery and more misery, diseases, creditors and, above all, the need to use his labor power as a journalistic commodity, an ironic situation of totally conscious alienation and, therefore, all the more painful. Gels, /Luskuals Lotschriften, Diet 7. Verlag, Berlin, 1953. Volume I, p. 70 *_. We have already advanced a stylistic judgment of the Grundrisse and the Critique of Political Economy, see Supra, 2.1. Our judgment must be repeated almost literally as regards capital and that appendix of its own which has come to take on an independent life, like the end of a gigantic inaudible when severed, the Theorien über den Meruere, which have not without reason been translated by W. Rosas, from Koski's incomplete edition, as critical history of the theory of surplus value, although perhaps it would have been better to say simply, theories of surplus value, or if one wanted to be more explicit, critical history of the bourgeois economy. As is well known, Capital was designed to encompass the entire theoretical system of man in one river work. From such a zeal of research and thought, only one volume, Book I, was finished to go to print. Which, without a doubt, explains the manifest superiority of this Book I, at least as far as the literary aspect is concerned. Books 2 and 3 represent an intermediate point, in that they were prepared by Engels for his publication. However, although Engels polished and redacted, he never let his own style fly above that of Marx's manuscript, which generally gives these two volumes a stylistically imprecise and opaque air. They are, however, full of definitive fragments that Marx would doubtless have left intact. In Book 3, for example, Marx's treatment of interest-bearing capital, Zinstragend Kapital, is notable, a matter that in itself would seem to be the most arid in the world, but which in Marx's hands becomes the most absolutely fleeting. Fetish of capital, the form in which money, its supreme fetish, seems to reproduce itself as by an act of transubstantiation, Formula DD, without the intervention of human labor, a fetish that, in reality, hides a concentration, the absolute form of dead or objectified labor that rises up, in banking and financial magic, as an all-encompassing power in the midst of society and against the producers, the owners of living labor. This form of capital is successively called Die Rein by Marx. Fetish form, the pure form of fetish, Die Dingglichselform, the most Cossack form, the Vollständig Saint Fetish, the most perfect fetish, the Fetish Artisant form, the most fetishistic form, or simply Fetischismus. In Book I, reaches in Book 3, with regard to the Trinitarian formula, a highly developed literary expression, which is also found in the theories of surplus value or Book 4. It had to be like this, since in the tripartite formula he writes in Book 3 of capital profit, or better yet, capital at interest, land rental from land and work salary. In this economic trinity, okonomische T1 and T, considered as the concatenation of the various component parts of value and wealth in general with their respective sources, the mystification of the capitalist production regime is consummated, the reification, Vertinglichung, of social relations, the direct intertwining of the material relations of production with their historical conditions, the enchanted, inverted, and turned upside-down world in which Monsieur Le Capital and Madame La Terre appear as poor social characters, at the same time that they carry out their witchcraft directly, as simple material things. The great merit of classical economics, of which Marx was the crowning glory, consists precisely in having dispelled this false appearance and deceit, this substantiation and crystallization of the different social elements of wealth among themselves, this personification of the things and this reification of the relations of production, this religion of daily life. Underscore. Dot. Asterisk. This characterization of the monetary and mercantile economy as the religion of daily life, dies Religion des Alltagslebens, represents the culmination and perfection of the great metaphor of religion, present here, moreover, stylistically in the Holy Economic Trinity, which we analyzed before, see Super 2.3. The stylistically best parts of the theories of surplus value deal precisely with these same themes. The architecture of this unfinished work is simpler and more linear than that of other works of Marx. He proceeds historically and analyzes one economist after another. First he cites the sources, offers fragments to study, and then begins the criticism, almost always devastating, but also fair, especially in the which refers to the recognition-le the merits of classical economics, without whose discoveries it would have been impossible for Marx to arrive at the theories of labor value and surplus value. Phrases such as dial are often found in this work. Ictic, analyzed in 2.2. Compare, for example, the phrases from the 1944 manuscripts already analyzed, in which we highlighted a game of opposites, with this one from Theory N. L. Diesem Widersprach die politische Ökonomie bloß das Wesen der kapitalistischen Produktion aus oder, wenn man will, der Lohnarbeit aus, der sich selbst entfremdeten Arbeit, der Vaniergeschaffen Reichtum als fremder Reichtum, ihr Signi Produktivskraft als Produktivskraft ihres Produzets, ihr Bereicherung als Selbstverarmung, ihr Gesellschaftlich Macht als Macht der Gesellschaft gegenüber Gegenüt. With this contradiction, that of the worker who, being indispensable for production, nevertheless receives the minimum wage, political economy limits itself to formulating what constitutes the essence of capitalist production, or, if preferred, of labor as a whole. Labor alienated from itself, to which the wealth created by itself confronts itself as foreign wealth, its own productive force as the productive force of its product, its enrichment as self-impoverishment, its social force as the source of society. Sky above 0.5 degrees. After the publication, in 1867, of Book I of Capital, Marx's workforce progressively became extinct, until his death in 1883. Among the writings of this period, they stand out. His texts on Russia, a country to whose study he dedicated himself with unusual intensity, to the point of learning the Russian language, and his critique of the program of the German Workers' Party, or Gotha program, from 1875, where he develops, as before in the Grundrisse, a grandiose perspective vision of communist society, which today retains all its validity and has in no way been, as many claim, denied by the deformations of the transitional societies towards socialism. And yes, on the other hand, it has been profoundly affirmed with the progressive emergence, in the most industrially developed nations, of a series of necessary structural preconditions as the basis of the future socialist society. It is there that Marx writes his great scientific utopia, in a higher phase of communist society, when the enslaving subordination of individuals to the division of labor and, therefore, the opposition between intellectual work and labor have disappeared. Body, when work has become not only the means of life, but also the primordial necessity of life, when, with the universal development of individuals, the productive forces have increased, and all the sources of cooperative wealth burst forth in abundance, only then will it be possible to overcome once and for all the narrow horizon of bourgeois right, and society will be able to write on its banners, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. 91. Such was Marx's stylistic parable. The points ended up touching, don't they tell us the same thing about the conditions of the universal disalienation of individuals, and with almost the same expressions, both the manuscripts of 44 and this late text? On March 14, 1883, Marx is surprised by death. As Engels tells Zarga, the doctors could have prolonged his life a few more years, but it would have been a vegetative existence, and how was Marx going to endure such a life, having so much work to finish and such a desire to do it? It would have been more bitter than this sweet death that surprised him. In 2 minutes this brilliant head stopped thinking. There is a text by Marx, little known despite its insight and grace, and in which they condense all the characteristics that we have found in his style, This is an excerpt from his address to the 4th anniversary of the People's Paper newspaper, on April 14, 1856. In our time, everything seems pregnant with its opposite. The machine has the marvelous power of shortening work and making it more productive, yet we see it starve and exhaust the workers. By the effect of some strange curse of fate, the new sources of wealth are transformed into sources of misery. The victories of technology seem to be obtained at the price of moral degradation. As humanity takes over nature, man seems to become a slave to his fellow men. Zero of its own infamy. It would seem that even the pure light of science needs, in order to shine, to say, from the darkness of ignorance, and that all our inventions and all our progress pursue a single end, to endow material forces with life and intelligence and degrade human life. This contrast of modern industry and science, on the one hand, and modern misery and dissolution, on the other, this antagonism between the productive forces and the social relations of our time is a fact of overwhelming evidence that no one would dare to deny. Some parties may deplore it, others may wish to be free from modern technology and therefore from modern conflicts. Moreover, they may believe that such notorious progress in the industrial field needs, in order to be perfect, no less no thorium setback in the political order. As for us, we do not allow ourselves to be deceived by the perfidious spirit that tirelessly points out all these contradictions to us. We know that the new forces in society call for new men to dominate them and make them work properly. Those new men are the workers. They are, as much as the machines themselves, an invention of modern times. In the signs that puzzle the bourgeoisie, the aristocracy, and the mediocre prophets of decadence, we recognize our noble friend, the old shoe that knows how to work quickly underground, the worthy pioneer, the revolution. In the Middle Ages there was a secret court in Germany, the Holy Weimar. When a house was marked with a red cross, it was known that its owner had been sentenced for that tribunal. Every house in Europe now bears the mysterious red cross. The judge is history, the executioner of the sentence, the proletariat too. 4. Epilogue on irony. Why? The alienation. In the class struggle in France, 1850, Marx writes in gold letters, "The mortgage that the peasant has on heavenly goods guarantees the mortgage that the bourgeoisie has on the big NCS of TMN.PCS10. In this brief sentence, whose stylistic and conceptual brilliance is obvious, or screams in the face, as the German twist that Marx used to say, "NS Schreien," sums up all the characteristics of style that I have highlighted in this study. The phrase, architecturally speaking, is perfect. It also complies with what we have called dialectic of expression, which is nothing other than the expression of dialectic. There is a very frequent combination in Marx, irony mixed with indignation. How many have tried to imitate the style of Marx, copying only indignation and forgetting irony? In order to be able to imitate Marx's style with stylistic grace, it would be necessary to remember that the entire machinery of his indignation appears to be constituted on the cogwheel of his irony. I die Hypothek. Welch der Bauer auf die himmlischen Güter besitzt, garantiert die Hypothek, welch der Bourgeois auf die Baumgüter besitzt, Marx Engels. The conceptual module of such irony is always given by that infinite capacity that Marx had to look backwards, or from the reverse side, at all the social phenomena of which economists, philosophers, and politicians saw only the appearance, the obverse. And the perceptual or stylistic module of transmitting this cunning of reason is in turn given by a no less infinite capacity to construct phrases and periods in whose ascending phase what we could call the obverse or appearance of things ironically appears. The mortgage that the peasant has on the celestial goods, and with whose descending phase the reverse or the hidden real structure appears behind the phenomena, it guarantees the mortgage that the bourgeoisie has on the peasant's goods. Throughout this book I have tried to show that these stylistic modules are by no means coincidences, witty quips, or mere ornaments with which a scientist illustrates his prose in order to make it more accessible, but rather, on the contrary, they constitute a harmonious whole with the conceptual system that, as verbal modules, they transmit. Thus, for example, the feature that we have just noted is the stylistic formula that gives complete expression to a central problem in Marx's thought. That irony that first describes to us the happy appearances of social relations to later denounce their real and miserable structure, that immense injunction against classical and vulgar economics, which he accuses of limiting itself to describing the apparent functions of capital and, therefore, hiding its antagonistic relationship with work, not all of this. It is but the concrete and special application of the general conception that Marx had of history. If Marx was a materialist, it was because he always endeavored to discover, behind or below the ideological appearances, state, right, religion, morality, metaphysics, with which historical facts, their material structure, are usually presented to us. Hence, their stylistic ironies always have a key function, the function of denouncing, illuminating reality. For the ideologue, everything historical development is reduced to the abstractions of historical development, he tells us in the German ideology. In other words, the irony that is constantly at work in Marx is not just any detail, but a key element in understanding his conception of history. It is often thought that Marx was ironic and mocking only because it was a psychological characteristic of him. It certainly was, judging from the testimonies of Mering and others, not to mention his correspondence, which in his field is as valuable as Flaubert's correspondence in his. Marx was fearsome and aggressive. However, he would be committing a gross optical error in thinking that everything remained a mere psychological and temperamental trait. It was also a theoretical temperature, irony, mockery and, in general, criticism. How many of Marx's works do not begin with the word criticism, formed a constituent part of the general theory of society and history. Societies are presented throughout history as legal political results, and the ideologue, like a good intellectual ostrich, after swallowing in one bite touches the real and material causes of events. In many cases, it limits itself to consigning superficially that societies are what their results are, with which these results are elevated to the category of foundations, and the effects appear as causes, and ideology appears as the real engine of history. Engels said that the characteristic of ideology, in the strict sense of the term, is to deal with thoughts, systems, or conceptual worlds, Gedankenwelt, as if they were independent worlds, objects, autonomous essentialities, Selbstständigen Wesenheiten, and he added that this results in losing sight of reality. Engels's contribution to the theory of ideology was as great as that of Marx. But this, however, is who provides us with the best material that we could call empirical for the study of the concept of ideology in its specific manifestations. Book 3 of Capital, for example, is littered with observations related to the polar contrast, appearance/structure, that is, relative to those social appearances, state, legal system, etc., that dazzle economists and make them wonder. They make us forget the true foundations on which all these appearances rest. Political economy is ghostly, it only sees the ghosts, the ghostly apparitions, the fantasies, the fetishes with which society dresses itself and which constitute, strictly speaking, its ideology. He only sees what can be seen with the naked eye, which is more or less the same as what a bacteriologist would see if he limited himself to studying bacteria without the aid of a microscope. In the field of social science the problem is not managing a microscope, but handle abstraction. So aware was Marx of this that it was the first thing he noted in the preface to the first edition of Capital. I have tried to set out as clearly as possible what refers to the analysis of the substance and magnitude of value. The flower, the map of value, which takes on a definitive body in the form of money, could not be more simple and flat. And yet, the spirit of man has spent more than 2,000 years struggling in vain to explain it to him, despite having managed, at least in an approximate way, to analyze forms that are much more complicated and pregnant with content. Why? Because it is easier to study the developed organism than the simple cell. In the analysis of economic forms, the microscope is useless nor chemical reagents. The only means at our disposal, in this field, is the capacity for abstraction. The form of merchandise that the product of labor adopts or the form of value that merchandise has is the economic cell of bourgeois society. Asterisk. The ideologue considers society and sees in it a developed organism, he sees a state, he sees a legal regime, he sees a private property regime enshrined in laws and eternity, he sees bronze laws, sees a bourgeois egalitarian right, etc., but he does not see, behind the state, the economic power, behind the legal regime, economic interests, behind the laws of private property, the expropriation of some by others, behind the bronze laws, the bronze of the economic yoke, behind the right. Egalitarian does not see the deep social inequality. Consequently, it is necessary to make a radical critique of ideology. But this critique, in Marx, is stylistically accompanied by irony. No criticism is as devastating as that which goes from irony to denunciation and from denunciation to irony. This trait acquires in the work of Marx, especially in his finished works and those printed during the lifetime of their author, an infinity of nuances. It goes, thus, from the irony of details to the irony of the capitalist system as a whole, going through the ferocious mockery of the system's apologists. An example of the irony of details is the fragment from the Critique of Political Economy that appears cited in the introduction of this study. A volume of propertio and 8 ounces of snuff can aspire to the same exchange value despite the disparity of the values of tobacco use and elegy. Why go looking for precisely the elegiac propertius to compare him with 8 ounces of snuff? The reason for this is genuinely stylistic. How to characterize with a single sentence an entire economic system based on exchange value, in the form of value of the form commodity, a system where the use value of things and goods goes to the background. The best way seems to be to ironically highlight how exchange value has such an overwhelming equalizing power that anything, no matter how lofty and illustrious it may be, is reduced to the same value as anything else, no matter how pedestrian it may be, as long as their magnitudes are equivalent. That is to say, an economic system. Based on the category of quantity, which has absolute power over the quality of things and even people. For the 8 ounces of snuff not only admit of comparison with the volume of propertius, the serious thing is that they can also be equated to human labor power, since one of Marx's greatest economic discoveries consists in having seen how, in capitalism, labor power possesses a specific use value capable of supporting an exchange value, that is to say, labor power is a commodity, it is sold in the labor market for a salary and it possesses the characteristic that most fascinates the owner of capital, namely, it is a commodity capable of producing other commodities, a machine that, instead of fuel and coal, is fed with a salary, strictly necessary for its maintenance as a labor force. That this merchandise thinks, suffers, laughs, cries and loves are additions without much importance. The capitalist system, as Marx said in Capital, hangs on its golden doors a sign that says, no admittance except on business. There is in the first book of Capital, which constitutes, from the point of view of scientific prose, one of the most perfect works ever written, comparable in its expressive magnetism to works like the Platonic Phaedrus, a chapter dedicated to the theme of the division of labor, chapter 12, where Marx takes the phenomenon of which we have been speaking to its final stylistic consequences. To speak of the division of labor is, for Marx, to speak of the beauty factor. Diachronically and synchronically speaking, of alienation. Over time, the division of labor, which began as the German ideology tells us as a division between physical and intellectual labor and achieved the constitution of a dominant religious administrative social sector, appears as the most remote and radical factor of the alienation of man. Only later did the other two determinants of alienation make their appearance, private property and mercantile production, which together with the division of labor constitute, today more than ever, the table of variables that explain alienation as a historical phenomenon. And, therefore, surmountable by overcoming the material factors in question. And although in the temporal order these factors appeared some before others, a synchronic vision of the current capitalist society has to consider them as a lattice work of variables in mutual interdependence, and in this analytic view, what was temporarily cause can appear as effect. Private property, for example, being a historical cause of alienation, it can, in its actual concrete forms, be derived by analysis, Dirk analyze, says Marx specifically, of alienation, and thus appears as an effect of it. This is how, incidentally, the apparent contradiction that some have found in the manuscripts of 1844 is resolved, in a passage where private property is presented as an effect, and not as a cause, of alienation. No one has so far noticed that Marx speaks very concretely of the possibility of deriving private property from alienation, but only Dirk analyze. And it is that one thing is the logical priority of the concept of alienation with respect to that of private property, and another very different thing is the real, historical priority of private property with respect to alienation, in the form in which we know it today, after of 7,000 years of history. If we go back to the most primitive form of alienation, that caused by the division of labor when property was still communal and collective, then we can conceive the appearance of private property as an effect history of that alienation that had previously appeared with the division of labor. Well, returning to our subject, in the aforementioned passage from Capital, which deals with the division of labor, there is Marx's most stylistically brilliant description of alienation in the very workshop of production, or, as he liked to say, in the hidden workshop of production. Let us read a fragment of the most characteristic. In manufacturing, as in simple cooperation, the physical individuality of the working worker is a form of existence of capital. The social mechanism of production, made up of many parceled individual workers, belongs to the capitalist. That is why the productive force that springs from the combination of labor is presented as the productive virtue of capital. True manufacturing not only submits previously independent workers to the command and discipline of capital, but also creates a hierarchy among the workers themselves, the germ of the current labor bureaucracy, ls. While simple cooperation leaves intact, in general, the way of working of each worker. Manufacturing revolutionizes it from foundation to finish and bites at the root of the individual workforce. It turns the worker into a monster, artificially fostering one of his partial abilities, at the cost of crushing a whole world of fertile stimuli and capacities, in the same way as in Argentine ranches an entire animal is sacrificed to remove its skin or remove its tallow. In addition to distributing the various partial works among various individuals, the individual himself is sectioned, turned into an automatic apparatus attached to a partial work, thus giving reality to that distressing fable by Menenius Agrippa, in which we see a man turned into a simple fragment of his own body. The chosen people had written on their foreheads that they were the property of Jehovah. The division of labor stamps on the forehead of the manufacturing worker the mark of its owner. Capital literary decision. The cited fragment is exemplary in a science that, like Marx's, understood itself as a denunciation. Empirical objectivity is not, for this science, an obstacle to ethical political judgment. That is why this science it deeply irritates all scientists who are in the service of capital, who try in vain to describe labor capital as ideological, when capital is precisely the greatest criticism ever made of ideology. Ideological science is, on the contrary, science placed at the service of capital and submissive to its dictates and needs. Precisely after the aforementioned passage, Marx says it with exemplary clarity. This process of dissociation begins with simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents the unity and the will of the social body of labor vis-a-vis individual workers. The process continues to advance in manufacturing, which mutilates the worker, by turning him into a partial worker. And it ends in big industry, where science is separated from work as an independent power of production and chained to the service of capital. And what is said of science is said of all culture. Marx quotes right there a very significant phrase by W. Thompson: between the man of culture and the worker producer stands an abyss, and science, which, placed in the hands of the worker, would serve to intensify his own productive forces, is almost always placed in front of him. Culture becomes an instrument capable of living apart from work and confronted with it. And why does this kind of hypostasis or alienation of science and culture occur with respect to the producers? Marx hints, and it is a pity that he did not go into more detail on this point, the real reason for this phenomenon, when he writes, the expansion of the world market and the colonial system, which figure among the general conditions of the system, provide the manufacturing period with abundant material for the regime of division of labor within society. We are not going to investigate in detail here how this regime takes over not only the economic orbit, but of all the other spheres of society, everywhere laying the foundations for this development of specialties and specialists, for that division of man that already made Ferguson, the teacher of A. Smith, exclaim, "We are creating a nation of helots, there is not a single free man among us." 37. This is the profound reason for the generalized alienation that, in all social spheres, affects the capitalist system of the 20th century, 100 years after Capital was written. Let's think what Marx would say about the fragmentation of man in the world of the large corporations of monopoly capitalism, where the division of labor has reached an astonishing extreme, would only prove the gross truth of his scientific prediction, for Marx was a predictive scientist, and not that prophet that he has religiously wanted to become. Now, as I have already insinuated in various parts of this essay, the best demonstration that Marx could leave us of how to overcome the division of labor in its current form, it is the beginning of the overcoming of alienation, it was his own work. No traces of division of labor are found in this work. Proteanly, Marx undertook all kinds of studies and incorporated into his investigations all kinds of ancient and modern materials. He merged separate disciplines into the vast river of a comprehensive social science, which is in itself and by its very nature the strongest possible indictment against the alienation of the specialties. He denounced political economy as an ideological alienation. Logic that separates economic facts from the rest of the social facts. In addition, he accompanied his theories with a practical political struggle, suffering exile, hunger and misery, death of his children, and at the same time laying the foundations of proletarian internationalism. And within all this brilliantly harmonious panorama, Marx always tried to endow his works with a brilliant literary force, since in addition to being a sociologist, economist, historian, linguist, etc., he was also a great writer, inserted in the best tradition. Neo-Latin literary. In his splendid work European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages, the Romanist Ernst Robert Curtius made an acute account of the main metaphorical forms that can be considered as genuinely Neo-Latin, the Theatrum Mundi metaphor, the nautical metaphors, the metaphors of the body, the metaphors of person, etc. We find all these metaphors planted in the work of Marx, sometimes in the form of classical allusions, sometimes through the creation of new metaphors based on old schemes of Greco-Roman and medieval rhetoric. But the best of all the metaphors discovered by Marx is gigantic, it is capitalist society as a whole. Metaphor, a Greek word, means translation or transfer from one meaning to another. In capitalist society there is a strange and all-encompassing transfer of the real meaning of human life to a distorted meaning. The capitalist metaphor is alienation. Aliena uncle in the Middle Ages, it meant transfer from one meaning to another, from the proper meaning of a word to a meaning that belongs to it. Improper. This impropriety can be positive and beautiful, as when we make literary metaphors and speak, for example, of the Platonic sun of ideas or the eyes of the soul, but it can also be negative, when we put a word to signify something that it does not really signify and thereby lead to confusion or amphibology. The same occurs with the capitalist alienatio, which is nothing but a monstrous metaphor. In capitalist society, the sense of use value, the sense of quality, sees itself expropriated from itself and replaced by the sense of exchange value, of quantity. Marx rightly translated the English word expropriation as Entauserung, which is the word we usually translate as alienation. In this society it is thought that ideology is the one that sustains the social edifice, instead of noticing that ideology rests on a foundation constituted by the socio-economic structure of society. In this society, the division of labor and the division of labor, private property feeds on public expropriation. The production of the market is not intended to satisfy human needs, but the needs of the market. In an aberrant social tautology, culture and science are not destined for human development, but for the division of man. If not for war, the prodigious development of the productive forces unceasingly generates immense wealth that, however, falls under the regime of private appropriation, and, finally, concrete man has been succeeded by abstract man, who in Marx's theory is the social producer of wealth. Is not all this transference of meanings a gigantic metaphor, a living metaphor? Is not the alienation of man a spectral metaphor that makes us live in an inverted world, where everything is pregnant with its opposite, as Marx said? Hence, the maximum stylistic achievement of that exceptional man was to present the capitalist world placed on its feet, for which it was first necessary to discover its metaphorical character, its alienated structure.